This is Don Krieg. But don't click away from the video just because of that. I promise this will be worth your time. Because Don Krieg is a guy who was there when we were hungry that one time, and he's a villain who I think goes criminally underappreciated. And I'm going to use words to tell you why. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the pirate fleet admiral and ruler of all of the East Blue, Don Krieg. That's how he describes himself anyway. Don Krieg really is just a little bit detached from fictional reality. And Krieg himself is more designed to hype up the much more greater threat that is the Grand Line. For example, when we meet the very first Krieg pirate, Geen, he strongly warns Luffy that, whatever you do, don't go to the Grand Line. And before we even see Don Krieg himself, what we see is his ship, an absolute beast of a vessel that looks like it would eat the entirety of Baratier as an entree, utterly beaten and destroyed. It's like a ghost ship that builds up the terror of the Grand Line. And in stark contrast, the first time we see Don Krieg himself is almost sympathetic. A starving man whose dreams have been destroyed, begging for the bare minimum to keep himself and his crew alive. Oh, what a lovely guy. Which of course is immediately identified as an obvious ruse, because this is foul play Krieg. Whatever rules there were, they aren't now. And Don Krieg has a fascinating background that most people forget about, because Don Krieg didn't start life as a pirate, no. He was originally a prisoner who managed to commandeer a marine ship and use that to deceive others. On occasion, he even opened up an engagement flying the white flag of surrender. It is said that his duplicity is legendary, so the kind of man we're dealing here is piracy incarnate. He embodies all of your stereotypical Yara pirate traits. He lies, he cheats, he steals, and not just to his enemies, but also to his own crew. He promised Geen that he wouldn't harm anyone on Baratier if he led him there, which Krieg instantly reneged on. And that's not even the only member he kills during this arc. In fact, it's difficult to find a crew member that Don Krieg doesn't at least try to kill. Krieg also shoots and kills one of his crew members for questioning why they'd want to return to the Grand Line. But whatever, crew people are disposable. Don Krieg has like 5,000 more of those things over there. And he also had, past tense, a fleet of 50 ships. So you know what, even considering Arlong, who did have a higher bounty than Krieg, Don Krieg is still the epitome of what East Blue had to offer. He was the biggest military threat. And there's some fantastic early Oda art during Baratier, specifically this panel of Krieg giving an order and insisting that those chefs don't defy him, and Oda's expression here is so strong. It's like Krieg exuding his own form of the conqueror's haki we have at home, which you can even see hitting the chefs in the next panel. And that's what makes the Grand Line so terrifying, because Don Krieg is the perfect pirate, and if even he can't last, then what exactly do you need to survive in the Grand Line? That is the question posed by this antagonist. Krieg also has a very simple motivation. His ship is in pieces and Krieg needs a new vessel. And Baratier could not be more perfect for someone like him. A floating restaurant to lure unsuspecting victims in, and so Krieg just keeps stealing and murdering until he's rebuilt his fleet. This is a bit of a subplot, but he also wants Zeph's logbook because in a rare instance of self-reflection, Krieg believes that his first voyage failed due to his own lack of knowledge. I point that out because it is the sole example of Krieg's self-reflection that we have in this arc. Everything else is unhinged narcissism. But much like Orangetown Buggy, Krieg is a mechanical character. And to some degree, I mean that quite literally, because the original idea for Don Krieg was that he was supposed to be a cyborg named Krieg 9000. So it was going to be even more of a contrast of mechanical power versus willpower. But I think this was toned down by Oda's editor at the time, who was very much excited about the world of One Piece, but always encouraged Oda to, maybe drip feed the more wacky ideas in. Another example being that Oda originally wanted to put Fishman in chapter 3, but the editor said, let's just hold off on that for a bit. But even watered down, the idea is still clear. Baratier was a showcase of mechanical power versus willpower. Don Krieg uses every weapon in his well-stocked arsenal against Luffy: bullets, blades, fire, explosives, poison, even shurikens at one point, all of which was a nightmare for the 4-Kid Stub to censor, resulting in fantastic inventions such as poison suction cups. But in contrast to that, you have Luffy, who steps into this battle with nothing. He may as well be completely naked, because all he have is his inner drive to win. Krieg is what I refer to as a pedestal character. He exists to raise up everyone else around him, and not draw too much attention to himself. Don Krieg is a skill test for Luffy's readiness to enter the Grand Line, because if Luffy can't beat Krieg, the guy whose time on the Grand Line couldn't even outlast one of Magellan's toilet sessions, then there's no point in even trying. He's a very direct contrast to Luffy as well. What we have here is traditional piracy versus Luffy's whatever his piracy is. At the time, we didn't really know. And so at this stage, it's almost like a statement from Oda saying that, yeah, the traditional stuff, stuff, we're not doing that anymore. We're moving away from that to something different. And it even comes down to a battle of dreams versus tangible reality, with Krieg stating, "I'll show that dreamer of a kid what strength really is." But Krieg is also quite the wide and girthsome podium with room for more than one character to stand on, and the other would be Sanji. Krieg, mate, he is the worst of the worst, and to all of that worst, Sanji says, "My job is to feed people, not to judge them. If a man is hungry, I feed him. That's a cook's job." So Krieg is there to show us who Sanji is at his core, and also to explore the idea of loyalty. In this arc, Krieg is the antagonistic version of Zeph, with Gin playing the role of antagonistic Sanji. And just as Sanji is undyingly loyal to Zeph, Gin will always remain loyal to Don Krieg, both of which are quite toxic loyalties in their own way. Sanji's loyalty preventing him from going out and following his dreams, and Gin's loyalty preventing him from following his morals. So when Gin finds a way to follow his morals while still retaining his loyalty to Krieg, even if that comes at the cost of his life, then that is the big push that Sanji needed to follow his dreams without feeling like he's abandoning Zeph. There's some really cool stuff going on here, but very little of it has to do with Krieg himself. He's almost a side character in his own arc. And there's even one point where he gets pushed out of the spotlight completely when Mihawk, an actually threatening character, arrives, and Don Krieg becomes one of those filler crowd characters who we just see observing the fights of the important characters. And for good reason, because Don Krieg is in character denial. Krieg even flat out says, "I've never lost a battle," which again, he's saying right after having lost to Mihawk and being forced to retreat from the Grand Line. Sometimes he even actively contradicts himself in the very same sentence. "It's true that I didn't succeed on the Grand Line, but I am Don Krieg, the mightiest of all," which, mate, you're not. If you were the mightiest of all, then you would have succeeded, but you didn't because you're not. And despite having been freshly defeated by Mihawk, he's always spouting stuff like, "I am stronger than anyone, arms of steel stronger than any flesh, a carapace of the strongest woot steel, diamond fist to demolish anything, and a built-in array of weapons." Although at this point, Krieg sounds more like a salesman than a conqueror, trying to sell you on the new high-tech pirate armor being sold by Krieg Corp. Here's a cool thing though. You'll notice that whenever Krieg is hyping himself up, he very rarely talks about himself as a man. He always points to all of the things he possesses, whether it be the armor, the high-tech weapons, his 50 ships, his 5,000 men. He never once attributes his greatness to a personal quality that he possesses, because Don Krieg is a fraud and he's in denial about it. Krieg even chooses to clad himself in golden armor. I should say it's not actually gold. Krieg does say it's steel, but it's more about what the gold represents. Gold as a substance actually makes terrible armor. It's simultaneously both heavier and softer than steel, so it's less practical to carry, a lot less actually capable of protecting you, and about a gazillion times more expensive to produce. The only thing that golden armor truly excels at is the aesthetics of the wearer, and Don Krieg's outfit reminds me a lot of the Emperor of Mankind from Warhammer 40k, whose glory days are always pictured in this stunning, radiant golden set of armor, and full gold tends to be an aesthetic favored by those who either are gods or trying to portray themselves as gods, which sounds a lot like Don Krieg when he says stuff like this, "I am Don Krieg, ruler of the world's seas." To this end, Krieg even specifically mentions that his armor is made out of woot steel, which dates back to 5th century BC in the real world. And so that adds to the whole idea of Krieg presenting himself as some sort of ancient deity. But I think that Mihawk sums it up best. Without subtlety, a sword is but an iron bar. And the same thing applies to the not so subtle Don Krieg. He has all of these over-the-top fancy weapons and defenses, but he lacks the subtlety and substance to put them to use. He thinks that just having them automatically makes him superior, because he's seen what strong godly men look like in movie films. So in Krieg's mind, if he cosplays that, he becomes that. And this trickles down to the rest of his crew as well, such as 2nd Unit Commander Pearl the Iron Wall, who takes strongly after Don Krieg by adopting his own set of armor and claiming that he is invincible. Pearl also has Krieg's annoying numbers mindset. "You're going to finish me? Impossible! In 61 battles to the death, I have won them all." Pearl even goes on to claim that he's never lost a drop of blood. And then, as soon as he starts bleeding, Pearl sets himself on fire and throws a tantrum. He's in denial that the thing he said was proved wrong. So Krieg and his crew, they are insufferable because they are grown adults acting like deluded children, completely unable to register their own flaws, which isn't necessarily a negative thing to say about these characters, because if that's their intention, then they portray that incredibly well. But if I had to properly critique Krieg, my question would be what led him to feel this entitled? Because this is an idea that Oda comes back to a lot. It was explored very well with Enel on Skypiea, but also persistently with the world nobles. And I understand why they feel entitled to rule the world, because that's the environment environment that they were raised in. What I want to know is how Krieg stumbled into that same mindset. In retrospect, I just want a bit more depth into his motivations. But to be fair, I do think that's asking a lot from an East Blue villain. It's just not really fair to compare them to later One Piece characters, but we're going to regardless because that's the entire premise of this video series. And there's also some nice hypocrisy of Don Krieg. When Mihawk arrives, Krieg says, "Look at what that dandy did to my ship." A dandy being a man who gives exaggerated attention to personal appearance, which happens to be exactly what Don Krieg is also. And as a side note, Don Krieg's glorious golden armor only covers his upper half. It doesn't even protect the most vulnerable of manly areas. So Luffy could have done a quick sack whack, like what he did with Buggy, and be done with him. Krieg is a facade. He's a cardboard cutout. Although there are a lot of similar ideas happening here that would make a return with Charlotte Katakuri. Like the idea of perfection. When Luffy smacks Don Krieg to the ground, his crew are in shock because, quote, "Until this moment, I've never seen the Don go down, not even on one knee." Don Krieg's crew are like the Charlotte family. And when Don Krieg is beaten, Keen even says, "He was the only man I ever admired. I thought he was the strongest man in the world," much like how Katakuri's family believed that he was invincible. So what we're working with here is very much the same concept of shattering that illusion of perfection. The key difference being that Katakuri did actually have the substance and drive to back it up, whereas Don Krieg really, again, is more of a cardboard cutout. And also a man with severe cognitive dissonance. When confronted by truth, Krieg retreats to the safe space of his mind palace until he's conjured an excuse that allows his truth to exist while still maintaining that he, Don Krieg, is the strongest man alive. With Mihawk, for example, Krieg saw what he did to his ships, Krieg saw what he did to Zoro, and Krieg concluded that Mihawk must be a devil fruit user, and that's the only reason why he was able to get one over on him, Don Krieg. Krieg is incapable of seeing true strength, because Krieg feels like he needs all of these accessories to make him a big, strong man. And so he assumes that Mihawk also needs all of those layers to be strong, so he's trying to find excuses where he can. So it's all projection, and they could not be more opposite personas. Don Krieg rocks up in this behemoth of a ship with the weapons and manpower to start his own military, and he can't even beat a goofy rubber boy. Meanwhile, Mihawk strolls in on a dinghy and is capable of dismantling everyone and everything with a butter knife. But look, to really amp up the palpable tension in the air of this video, Baratier is a Don Krieg striptease. He takes the stage proudly flaunting himself, and we gradually strip him of everything until his tiny truth is revealed and he flees in shame. We take all of his prized possessions and point out how hollow they are. His colossal warship, sliced up by a bored swordsman. His 5,000 men, well, as Luffy puts it, "You're not tough. There's just so many of you." Meanwhile, Krieg's weapons consistently fail to do any real damage, and it does get to the point where we literally strip Don Krieg when Luffy breaks his golden armor. Again, he's here to showcase the difference between mechanical power, firepower, and just willpower. As Zeph says, in the end, it's not about weapons. Grit counts more than steel. Which is always best demonstrated when Krieg whips out his cloak of spikes and Luffy thwacks Krieg in the face anyway. That is Luffy's willpower overcoming Krieg's mechanical power. And then after knocking him down, Luffy has this incredibly hardcore line. "So whose grave is that again? Mine or yours?" And it's just, my god, Don Krieg makes Luffy look and sound so good. He is such a wonderful pedestal. And this whole fight is filled with fantastic artistic contrast. Like this shot of Krieg being kicked in the neck. You have this being clad in this godlike armor, getting damaged by a teenager in sandals. The best armor that money can buy, literally encrusted with diamonds, losing to the cheapest footwear that money can buy. In fact, you probably don't even buy them. Luffy probably found them in a bin somewhere. I find immense satisfaction in watching Krieg being dismantled piece by piece. And there is one thing that I actually do really respect about Don Krieg, which is that, delusions aside, he was intelligent and driven enough to have a solid plan to beat Luffy. For one thing, he always waits for Luffy to make a charge at him, which makes Luffy significantly more vulnerable to all of the seawater around him. And during the final clash, you could even call this fight a draw because Luffy knocks Krieg out, but Krieg simultaneously captures Luffy in his net and dooms him to drowning to death. It was a proper double knockout, and just before Luffy hits the water, he even makes the trademark Will of D smile, indicating that death is incoming. It's hard to believe, but Don Krieg actually outdid Arlong when it came to combat and strategy against Luffy, so he does deserve recognition for that. He He did something that very, very few villains have been capable of. And to add to that, he also regains consciousness before Luffy and is ready to keep fighting before Gin knocks him out. And as cool as all of that is, there are so many more interesting things happening during Baratie that overshadows Krieg. Krieg gets pushed into the background by stuff like Sanji's story, Zoro vs. Mihawk, Nami's betrayal, and even Gin's story. Gin is a more memorable character than Don Krieg, and that's a problem when you're supposed to be the big bad antagonist. And what's worse is that what Krieg sorely lacks is a post-Baratie character arc. And while I certainly don't know what more I would want from Krieg, it makes him feel quite underwhelming compared to almost every other villain that has gone on to have a story beyond Luffy. Don Krieg is definitely an essential part of the Baratie arc. He is a core mechanical opponent and it does fall apart without him. Which is why when many celebrated that Don Krieg was going to be sidelined in the One Piece live action project, I was quite hesitant, and I do think that the series suffered, specifically during Baratie, because it doesn't have the mechanical push of Don Krieg to make everything else we love about that arc function. But he's not really anything more than a component either. He's a purposely hollow threat with a reasonable but kind of boring motivation, who often gets treated as a side character in his own arc, and doesn't go on to make anything of himself after Baratie. So with all of that in mind, I think the only fair way to rank Don Krieg is to give him that middling C tier, because as a villain, he does everything he's meant to do for the sake of the story, for the sake of Oda's themes, and for the sake of the characters we actually do care about, but he doesn't excel or really make his mark on One Piece. After seeing what One Piece is like without him in the live action, I definitely appreciate Krieg's role a lot more, but it doesn't really change how Don Krieg stacks up against other villains himself. But you let me know in the comments, which villain would you like to see ranked next? This is Charlotte Lin Lin, one of the most controversial and polarizing antagonists in all of the One Piece, a character of high highs, high calories, and low lows, as well as the user of probably the two most infamous words of dialogue ever uttered in the series that still strikes fear into the hearts of One Piece fans on their very special day as they prepare to cut their wedding gukeki. But of course, today is a special day for everyone because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the strongest hag in the world, Charlotte Lin Lin. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way either, that is her official title. This next part, however, is derogatory. Much like her rotund physique, the story of Charlotte Lin Lin is difficult to fit in a condensed space, such as this video. So more broadly speaking, we need to analyze Big Mom in three distinct sections, because her tenure as a villain covers a higher proportion of One Piece than most antagonists. The first and largest of which doesn't even include her for the most part, but it is the most critical, which is the 10-year period that is Big Mom's slow burn introduction. One of the very slowest and also very best villain builds in One Piece. All the way back in chapter 432, Garp introduces the concept of the Four Emperors, revealing the ceiling of piracy for the very first time. A four-way power struggle in the New World. And the most sinister thing is that we don't even find out her name in this introduction. All we see is this terrifying semi-silhouette, which is an image that would become burned into the back of our mind brains, lurking in the background for hundreds and hundreds of chapters. We wouldn't learn her name until years later when Eustace Kid casually dropped it in chapter 581. Then, after we got into the New World, we saw her Jolly Roger on Fishman Island, and at the very end of that arc, we received our first proper encounter with Big Mom, and this was simply horrifying. We cut to an island that appears to be made entirely out of cake, which is weird even by One Piece standards, and we are subjected to close-ups of various bits of Big Mom's face, almost as if she's so colossal that Oda cannot possibly cram it all in one frame. We see her strained eye, then an absolutely disgusting close-up of her mouth with all the mouth juices and such. I don't like it. And what's worse is that I believe this is the perspective of the unfortunate person who she then goes on to eat. And we then cut to a very full body shot of her, and what we see is a colossal contorted slug on a throne. Her individual teeth are twice the size of most people's heads, and what we're looking at here, it is simply not human. It is a morbidly obese demon cursed by gluttony who can do nothing but consume and consume. She's portrayed as less of a One Piece character and more like a demon from Berserk. Of all of the villains in One Piece, Big Mom is one of the only ones to have inspired a feeling of true terror within me, because a lot of antagonists are capable of being intimidating and overwhelming, but not a lot of them are able to make me think of the most viscerally disgusting ways that they would kill me. Big Mom also manages to conjure a very morbid curiosity, because, to be blunt, she doesn't have the presence or the physique of what power traditionally looks like in this world. So to think that she is one of the 4 strongest pirates on the planet means that there is an even more sinister twist waiting for us underneath all that. And we would finally discover what that was in chapter 827 when we cut to Totterland and witness Big Mom in the light of day for the very first time. And if you don't read the words, this picture looks lovely and delightful, like something you'd paint on a preschool wall. But then you remember that you can speak English and you start reading, and oh my god, the lyrics that she's singing. Let's all eat a tasty cake. It's the sweetest deal to make. The tea party from hell. Is it strawberry jam or someone's blood? Either one is fine. If you're invited, you have to come. A demonic sacrifice for our sweet pastime. This is our beloved land of dreams, a country where all people come together. It's Totterland. Oh, I can't wait. He's here, you say? Straw Hat. And with all of that, ready or not, it is time to step straight into hell and tackle this demon. Almost exactly 400 chapters and 10 years after we saw her silhouette on Water 7, we were now face to face with a face that I would never want to face. I want to linger on that for a bit, because this is the great strength of One Piece that no other manga can replicate, which is extreme seeding. One Piece can afford to spend 10 years building a major antagonist in the background, and Big Mom is far from the only character to receive that treatment, but I think it works particularly well with her because Charlotte Linlin's existence is a haunting presence. During that time, she's almost like a recurring nightmare that pops up every now and then, something that, in some cases, literally haunted people from childhood into adulthood, some people being me. I would have been 16 or 17 when I first saw her, and that looming nightmare persisted well into my adult life. So in terms of build-up, I think that Big Mom was handled flawlessly. But after this, Oda had to make good on this build. The luxury One Piece has is setup time, so much setup time. But the burden One Piece has is needing to pay off that 10 years of setup, because at that point, expectations are pretty damn high. And Charlotte Linlin did not disappoint during her run as a main antagonist on Whole Cake Island, treating us to the terror of her devil fruit, the Soro Soro no Mi, allowing her to manipulate the souls of herself and, more importantly, others, souls which she can then use as a resource to craft whatever her imagination desires. It is not an exaggeration to say that she possesses godlike power. Linlin can control the weather. In her left hand are the lightning clouds of Zeus, and in her right is the sun itself, Prometheus. And it's just, how do you even begin to take on someone like that? Well, as the arc goes on, we discover the answer, which is that you don't. All you can do is run. To this very day, this still hasn't been properly explained, but Big Mom was literally born different. As soon as she popped out of her poor, normal-sized mother's birth hole, Charlotte Linlin possessed godlike strength and durability, because even without using haki, her skin was described as an iron balloon. She can tank Luffy's then strongest attack with no issue at all, meaning that she has both maximum offensive and defensive power. And that is not even the worst part. The staggering terror of Big Mom is that deep within her resides an entity that I can only describe as a demon, a gluttonous force that takes over whenever Linlin becomes even mildly hungry, going on to throw apocalyptic tantrums until its needs have been met, meaning that she is an enemy to both friend and foe. She's even willing to kill her own children in this state. Although to be fair, she has a lot of them, and you know what, maybe cutting back wouldn't be such a bad idea. Something very important to emphasize is that to face Big Mom is to face her family, which consists of 39 daughters, 46 sons, and her extended forces of thousands. This is such a big escalation to anything we've ever faced before this point. We're not playing pirates anymore. To take down someone like this, you need an army. And at the very top ranks, Big Mom has her suite commanders, all of whom are considered world-class pirates in their own right. And fun fact, there was a point in One Piece history where, during Whole Cake Island, 4 of the top 5 highest known bounties were held by Big Mom's children. From highest to lowest it went: Charlotte Katakuri, Jack, Charlotte Smoothie, Charlotte Cracker, and Charlotte Perospero. That's a lot of Charlotte. So it was a pretty wild point in history, especially considering that we were currently in an arc facing off against 4 of those top 5 highest known bounties. It was overwhelming. Whole Cake Island felt like the Straw Hats against the world, and the Straw Hats weren't even at full power. But to linger on family a bit more, Big Mom doesn't exist in a villainous vacuum. Narratively, she has a very important role, which is that she is here to contribute to one of the larger motifs of Whole Cake Island, which is family. You've got the classic One Piece biological family versus found family. You've got Sanji and Germa 66. Capone Gang Beige even has his surprisingly positive family dynamic. And then there are so many inter-family dynamics within the Charlotte clan itself, like the relationship between Katakuri and Brûlé, or the defection of Charlotte Praline. Praline or Praline? I don't know these fancy words. Praline.
Praline.
Yes. The defection of Charlotte Praline after marrying Aladdin, Pound and Chiffon, and so on. We're not going to go too deeply into that because it is a massive topic and it moves away from Charlotte Linlin as an individual. But I cannot stress this enough. Family is a direct extension of Charlotte Linlin herself. You cannot analyze her without also analyzing that aspect. And I can't help but feel that a lot of people who read or watch One Piece for the fun one-on-one fights end up being quite disappointed and expect Big Mom to act in a more standard shonen antagonist manner. And I do feel that Big Mom is a very misunderstood character in general, because I'm actually quite a big fan of her, especially her motivation, which is, my dream is for all people and races around the world to be my family and sit at the same table at the same eye level, which is her inherited will from hearing Mother Carmel say a similar thing to her as a child. And it's a beautiful thing to say. However, it both spawns from a very dark place and leads to much darker places. Because here's the thing, it's a great thing to say, but it's not her true motivation. What Charlotte Linlin really wants is to recapture the happiest moment of her life, which was her 6th birthday party, where she was surrounded by a table of people from a variety of races who all loved her and gave her tasty, tasty food to eat. She's pursuing Carmel's words because she believes that that is the only way to get back to that blissful existence. So everything she does over the next 62, 63 years is a desperate struggle to artificially recreate this one organic moment of bliss and contentment. In this effort, she coerces people into joining her empire. She forces people to be around her. She demands that they make her tasty food all the time, and she expects their unconditional love and admiration. Big Mom is only looking to create her own personal utopia. And on top of that, she also has a profound fear of abandonment due to her parents dumping her in Elbaf, and from Linlin's perspective, Mother Carmel and all of her friends abandoning her at the orphanage. Of course, the dark, sinister truth behind that incident is that Big Mom accidentally ate all of her friends in a hunger-driven fugue state, but Linlin would never figure that out. And on top of that, she was then found by the worst possible person, Streusen, who took this genuinely innocent child and groomed her to become the sickening demon we encounter today. With the right mentor, Big Mom could have remained on the right tier of the morality cake, but Streusen reinforced all of Linlin's most negative aspects and is directly responsible for the reign of terror that followed. All of which is to say, I understand Charlotte Linlin, and I feel sorry for her. Ultimately, all she wants is to be happy. She wants that moment from her childhood back. But she's been led down a very dark path and is now going about it in the most twisted way possible. For example, part of Big Mom's dream is to incorporate giants into her family. So she goes and pays Caesar Clown to kidnap children and perform gigantification experiments on them. Her dream is very superficial and definitely selfish. Big Mom wants a family because she doesn't want to be alone. She never wants to feel the abandonment she experienced as a child. So she's not so much concerned with the well-being of those around her. All she wants is for them to be around her. And to make this point, even her daughter's wedding was structured to be all about Charlotte Linlin. The wedding cake was made for her, all of the guests brought her presents instead of the bride and groom, and the whole ceremony was designed to honor Big Mom. Big Mom is a child in the body of a 68-year-old woman. Most children grow up, experience adversity and obstacles that requires them to grow and mature, to change their worldview to become a productive member of society. But Big Mom is what happens when a child is given the power of a god and never has to mentally mature, because the solution to every problem for the last 68 years has genuinely been to throw a tantrum. Big Mom's life is a literal Disney musical, and she values life in the same way that a child values toys, which is an incredibly dangerous mindset, because I'm not convinced that Big Mom 100% understands what she's doing when she decides to kill someone. This is despite the fact that she says stuff like, Germa's blood will spill before they can so much as tremble in fear, gunshots going off like fireworks, a rain of bullets that continues to riddle their dead bodies, and that's not even the end, that continues for a bit, which is horrible. But to Big Mom, this isn't particularly different from playing with toy soldiers and having them kill each other by going with the guns and such. That sounded more like a goat, but I'm not doing it again. So we have a perfectly set up character with understandable, and for me personally, even empathizable motivations. But I think the action-based implementation and the final third of Whole Cake Island is really where Big Mom starts to lose some people. Something I do need to mention is that the climax of this arc is 30 chapters long, where the crew are running from Big Mom, and during this time, she pretty much says 2 exclusive words over and over and over, which are of course wedding cake. And bear in your mind that 30 chapters is just under a year's worth of content. So to spend a year of your life watching this elderly woman screaming wedding cake over and over and over again every week, it's a big ask, and it does get quite fatiguing. And another part that gets a bit contentious is this impression that Big Mom is stripped of her power because the crew keep outsmarting and outplaying her, making Big Mom look quite ineffective, but to that I would say that that's very much the point. Again, Big Mom mentally is a child, and for a crew that work particularly well together with versatile abilities, no, they can't defeat her, but they can outwit her. And something I also appreciate about Lin Lin is that rather unusually, it does not fall to Luffy to defeat Big Mom. His task in this arc is more focused on Katakuri, who will have his own video, but instead Big Mom is more Sanji's challenge to overcome because the task becomes to bake a cake that will be good enough to stop the hunger tantrum and knock her out long enough to allow the Straw Hats to escape. And there's a shocking amount of tension surrounding the cake itself, with even First Son Perospero saying, "Steel yourselves, our fate rests within the flavor of that cake," which is a ridiculous line to say out of context, but he is completely correct. If Sanji can't satisfy Big Mom, if Sanji can't satisfy Big Mom, then all of Totoland and maybe the world is going to be destroyed. It's quite a unique climax for One Piece, which does tend to fall back on your very standard tried and tested formula most of the time. I will say that the ending tends to be quite conflicting though, because I actually like that we do not beat her during Whole Cake Island. After seeding her as this demonic entity for 10 years, I really like that we encountered the demon and we were powerless to do anything except run from it. It was a very needed warning that you need to be so wary and ready to throw your life away if you are going to confront an Emperor of the Sea. And that next time against Kaido, mate, we need to be far more prepared. And the other thing I like is that the antagonist wins. Yes, the Straw Hats escaped and Big Mom's plan was foiled, but thanks to Sanji's cake, Big Mom got exactly what she wanted, which was to relive her moment of childhood happiness. Sanji's cake was so good that it transported Big Mom back to the most blissful moment of her life. She even sees visions of Carmel and her friends, and so Sanji succeeded in doing what Big Mom had spent 6 decades failing to do. It's a happy ending for Big Mom, and I think a really great closure of her character. Everything Oda wanted to explore with her was complete in this moment. And if we're looking at Big Mom through the lens of these 2 sections of her build-up and her main antagonist arc, then she would be an easy S tier for me. But there is a 3rd section because her story does not end there. In fact, after this point, we've got 4 more years of Big Mom to cover, because she then follows Luffy to Wano to take revenge on him. And going forward, I think that Big Mom suffers from the Jack problem, which we examined in his video, where they are perfect thematic antagonists, exploring very specific ideas in their own dedicated arcs that are then carried over to Wano, and Oda kind of struggles to find something else to do with them. And even though I think he succeeded with Big Mom infinitely more than he did with Jack, she is still a piece that doesn't fit quite cleanly into Wano. Big Mom is, for want of a thesaurus, too big to share the stage, and during Wano she had to take a backseat to not only Kaido but also Orochi. They were the 2 lead villains of this arc, and it doesn't feel amazing to have someone of Big Mom's caliber pushed into the background. It's almost an insult to everything that Oda has built with her. We have this unstoppable godlike demon, but then don't pay attention to her. Instead, look at this snake pervert over here. Isn't he fun? And that's fair. Orochi is a villain who was specifically crafted with the themes of Wano in mind. He should get more attention, whereas Big Mom was made for the themes of Whole Cake Island, so taking her from that and using her here is a lot more haphazard. And so what Oda ended up needing to do is keep Big Mom out of the main narrative until it was time for her to be defeated, which he does to questionable results. On Wano, Oda gives her a side quest to do over there, which is that immediately after landing, she is struck with amnesia and takes on the persona of Olin. So it's no secret that I despise amnesia in stories. 99 times out of 100, it's not used well, and as a reader, it tends to feel very lazy. Situations where the author needs a reason for a character to either do something or to not do something, but then can't think of a realistic reason, so I don't know, amnesia? So in defense of this case, what I like about it is that it confirmed the hypothesis that Lin Lin would have grown up to become a force of good. Because after forgetting all of Stroisen's influence, Lin Lin becomes a very kind-hearted, friendly person, and even forms bonds with a couple of Wano characters. So I did like getting to see that different side of her, that alternate what she could have become. What I don't like is that after this experience, moments, she doesn't change at all. As soon as the amnesia wears off, we are back to the status quo, which makes the whole affair feel very mechanical and almost like filler. As if Oda needed a way to break Luffy out of prison, and I guess this was the solution. It wasn't contributing to Big Mom, it was using her as a tool. Which is fine, characters serve mechanical purposes all the time, even Straw Hats, but just imagine if this had happened to another emperor, like say Kaido, Shanks, or Whitebeard. It would never happen because Oda treats them all with the respect of their status. These are 4 billion plus bounty level pirates. So with Big Mom, it's like casting an A-list actor as an extra. She is well above the job she's being given here, although her role does ramp up once the raid begins. Another thing I liked about her on Wano is that we do get to see how Big Mom functions, or more accurately, does not function without her family, because this is a complete shit show for her. There's lots of amazing fight scenes that involve Linlin, but she does look very incompetent, and that's because she is. She's missing her family to pick up that slack. So while she was undefeatable on Whole Cake Island, on Wano she is extremely vulnerable. And that is a nice back-to-back arc contrast. But regarding her final fight, Linlin ends up taking on both Trafalgar Law and Eustace Kid, which is a fantastic spectacle fight, but to me it lacks a lot of the substance that other Wano fights have. Conflicts like Robin needing to become a demon to overcome someone who pretends to be a demon, then Sanji essentially facing off against his entire family whose powers are possessed by Queen, and even Raizo versus Fukurokuju, which gets memed on a lot because it's just him standing in the fire, but underneath all of that, it is his own personal tribute to Kozuki Oden standing in the boiling pot. It has meaning behind it, and Big Mom doesn't really have that next level of depth that I've come to expect from One Piece. And it's because her opponents, Kid and Law, aren't too different to Big Mom in this situation. All three of them were characters who were designed to explore different stories that then ended up on Wano. Big Mom had her themes on Whole Cake Island, Law was the heart of Dressrosa, and Eustace Kid, well, I'm not convinced that Oda ever had greater plans for him, unfortunately. But what we get is these three outsider characters who don't really have any strong connection or emotional response to one another, and you make them fight, and then that's what happened. To be as pedantic as I could, Kid does have a little connection to Big Mom because it's said that he attacked her forces during the time skip, but it's such a minor thread that it still feels like nothing. So this conflict, it wasn't bad, but I do think it gets overshadowed by everything that had that extra layer of meaning behind it. Although there's one key exception to that. This is not a negative against Big Mom, but her being defeated before Kaido claims that first hit of finally conquering an Emperor of the Sea, and it lessens the impact when Luffy went on to beat Kaido. But I'm gonna go ahead and say that that's Kaido's problem, not Big Mom's. And in the end, look, I don't know how I would have changed anything on Wano to make her hit any harder, because I really like that Big Mom was victorious on Whole Cake Island, and defeating her there would have been completely unrealistic and definitely unsatisfying. But then carrying her over to Wano came with a lot of problems that very much reduced an Emperor of the Sea to being a side character. And again, I also think that everything I've said about her on Wano is very nitpicky, because Big Mom definitely does not shit the bed in the same way that Jack did. His follow-up completely ruined him. Whereas Big Mom was more of a, she's still really fun, but just not quite as satisfying. Big Mom had one of the best villain builds, commanded a mostly fantastic and unique arc as the main antagonist, with a ton of depth behind her, and then did an okay job as a secondary antagonist after that. So in the end, I am going to give her an A+, because she's not perfect, but holy crap, Big Mom was an experience. And for someone who was at the forefront of One Piece as a major antagonist for 6 whole years across Whole Cake Island and Wano, I think she pulled off an incredibly difficult job very, very well. But you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Hody Jones, and if you were to ask the average One Piece fan who the worst arc antagonist is, I would bet so many units of currency that Hody Jones would be the most common answer. And the crazy thing is, all of those people are wrong. Hody Jones is misunderstood, not because of who he is, but because of what he represents and how Eiichiro Oda may very well have created a villain who is too smart for One Piece. And today we're going to discover why, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the all of the that is Hody Jones. So let's set the stage. Hody Jones is the main antagonist of what was at the time the highly anticipated Fishman Island arc. The Straw Hats reunite after 2 years of training, set sail to Fishman Island, and find themselves caught up in a revolution led by Hody Jones, who believes that he has been anointed by the sea heavens to guide fishmen on a brutal crusade to eradicate humanity. TLDR, he's not a very nice man. So Luffy beats him, Hody goes to jail, and also, he's an old man now because of reasons, and that's that. Job done. At least that's how a lot of people seem to think it goes. But there is actually a lot going on here. More so than most One Piece arcs, and more so than most One Piece villains. Hody Jones is probably the most unique antagonist in One Piece, and it's not just because he has 2 penises, which Eiichiro Oda revealed in the SBS Volume 75 because it is information that we all need to know. But let's start at the surface. The moment that Hody Jones waddled his way into the manga, he was immediately branded by the fans as Fat Arlong, the before image in Arlong's inspirational weight loss journey. And he could not get away from Arlong. It's a comparison that Oda himself made when Hody is speaking on a page and Nami sees Arlong speaking behind him. Usopp then goes on to say, "Those fishmen want to pick up where Arlong left off," and this comparison to Arlong is key to understanding the initial wave of disappointment, as this arc was the very first full-length post-time skip arc. So readers were looking forward to seeing our brand new Straw Hats go all out and show off their wonderfully shiny techniques against new powerful opponents. This was the new world after all, so look, who's up first? Are we gonna take out a worst generation member, or maybe another warlord like Doflamingo? Ooh, that would be cool. Actually, you know what? What if we go straight for the head of an Emperor of the Sea? There is so much potential to be had here, and the answer we eventually got when reading Weekly was, nah mates, we're gonna do Arlong again. Except this time longer and wider. Longer story and wider stomach, that is. Which I don't think was an amazing start to the second half of the series. Not only did it feel like we weren't progressing, but it actively felt like taking a step back in some ways, because we were dealing with the Arlong we have at home. This is an impression that I think Hody really struggled and ultimately didn't quite overcome in the minds of many fans. But we are going to fix that. The first common criticism for Hody Jones being a bad villain is his motivation or overly simplistic lack thereof. Hody is usually remembered as the racism villain. In fact, in the One Piece wiki, under the personality section, the first 4 words are, Hody is a racist. However, I believe that underplays the severity of his condition. And shockingly, nowhere in that One Piece wiki article do they address the core of the character that the article's about. What people don't talk about enough, if at all, with Hody Jones starts at religion, as Hody spent his childhood being preached to, and one of the head priests was Arlong himself, who said, "This is a holy war." Long ago, the scum known as mankind feared and envied the superior fishmen who had been granted natural strength. The humans are terrified of the judgment they know is coming, for our moment of vengeance. So there's a lot to unpack there, but most importantly, this issue isn't as basic as Hody was a racist. It's that he was relentlessly indoctrinated into this belief as a child. His will was stolen away from him and replaced with a prison of ideas. But this is also what made Hody such a fantastic soldier. The Minister of the Right, which I always forget which one, I think it's the Seahorse one. In either case, one of them even stated that Hody Jones was one of the king's finest soldiers, and of course he was. Having grown up with this extremist religious mindset, Hody follows orders unquestioningly, and his devotion would be unparalleled. So long as he saw a course of action as being on the right path, Hody Jones would excel at implementing said action. But when it comes to religion, you usually need something a bit higher to believe in, like some sort of savior or messiah. And so Hody's faction started to believe that the messiah figure who would lead them would be Fisher Tiger. Although when Tiger died, Zeo said, "So Tiger wasn't our chosen hero either." And that's a problem. If not him, then who would be the chosen one? Well, obviously Hody himself, when he gets a hold of the energy steroids and claims, "Finally, the heavens have chosen us and given us power." Now, before we move on, there is a lot more blame to be thrown around here, because it's not just fishmen who created Hody. In fact, Hody was radicalized just as much by the world government as he was from the hateful faction of fishmen. Whilst Fisher Tiger and the Sun Pirates were active, the world government and Big News Morkins did everything they could to paint them as brutal monsters. They would publish stories to dehumanize the Sun Pirates as much as possible, despite the fact that Fisher Tiger had a very strict code of morality that he would adhere to, which was no killing and no unnecessary brutality. Their goal was to free slaves, to stop suffering rather than deliberately inflict more of it. But that is not the Fisher Tiger that Hody Jones got to know. All he read about in the propaganda-filled newspapers was about a vengeance-filled monster that the world government feared. So Hody grew up believing that their lies were the correct way to act, that fishermen had to be as brutal as possible towards humans because that's what his savior was doing. Hody Jones was quite literally radicalized by fake news. This was news designed to scare humans, to galvanize support for the world government, but it had the unintended effect of inspiring mentoring Hody. It gave him a role model and a path forward. And also, one pivotal piece of misinformation was when Fisher Tiger's death was reported, and it was stated that he died because humans had refused to give him blood. Of course, we know that it's because Tiger himself refused human blood, but this one was Arlong's lie, which he told to protect Fisher Tiger's reputation. Otherwise, it would have gotten out that he had been a slave. And all of this context and experience is what Hody Jones was completely lacking. All he read in the newspapers is that humans doomed Fisher Tiger, his hero, whose mission was to slaughter each and every one of them, and now someone would have to take up that mantle. Hody Jones is a product of his environment, but here's the most important thing. This is the key to appreciating the majesty of Hody Jones, which is that it's not about Hody at all. Chapter 643 is called Phantom. This also happens to be the chapter where Robin called Jinbei a quote handsome man and started a whole new shipping industry that endures to this very day. But it's called Phantom because this is where Prince Fukaboshi reveals the true nature of Hody Jones. Hody is a monster born from his environment. The new fisherman pirates are monsters created by hatred. They live in fear of their ancestors' hatred being forgotten, live in fear of the days that anger at the humans is forgotten. They live in the hope that their holy war is just, that humans are evil. They desire blood. They don't even want peace for Fishman Island. This hatred they wield is entirely void of any kind of experience and will. Hody is entirely empty. There is no substance within him. That last line in particular is often directly quoted when people complain about Hody online. It's often said that, mate, Hody is such a bad villain that even the author admits he lacks substance. But that is exactly the point. I often hear and even say that the best written villains are the ones you can understand, not the ones you can agree or empathize with, but the ones whose actions you at least understand. And I think that is usually true, which makes Hody Jones a very challenging idea because people try to understand him. However, it's a pointless exercise because he is not the true villain here. So this is going to sound wanky, be prepared for that, but the true villain of Fishman Island is hatred itself. Hody Jones is but a phantom, a lingering presence of the hatred of the past, continuously sustaining itself so as not to be forgotten. Hody himself has no substance, so if you go looking for any, then yes, you're going to be disappointed. Which is why I really don't like it when people boil Hody down to being a racist. He isn't just a racist, it is so much worse than that. He is hatred incarnate. He is the inherited hatred of generations and generations of fishermen. As an individual, Hody himself doesn't even know why he's doing the things it is that he does. At one point, he even admits that humans have never done anything to him, a point that the anime adaptation goes on to ruin by showing a filler scene of humans trying to kidnap Hody and his friends. But as far as the manga goes, no human has ever done a bad thing or indeed even a thing to Hody Jones. In fact, over the course of his career, Hody has damaged almost exclusively fishermen, which in theory that should be a big no-no for his cause. And there's even one part where Ha-Chang compares him to Arlong, and he stated that Arlong would never harm his fellow fishermen. However, Hody would immediately kill anyone who showed even a hint of sympathy towards humans. To Hody, it doesn't matter, because he's not doing this for the reasons that he says he is. He doesn't have some grand vision for a fisherman utopia. No, he spreads hatred purely for the sake of cultivating more hatred. He is a metaphorical flame trying desperately not to die out, to burn as much as possible around him until nothing is left. And I think this is best depicted near the end of Fishman Island, where it's almost like Hody is being possessed by a demon. He loses what little facade of individuality he had and becomes something completely unrecognizable and not of this world. And something very clever that Oda does is with the Jolly Roger of the new Fishman Pirates. Jolly Rogers in One Piece are the representation of the captain. Your classic one is the Straw Hat Pirates portraying Luffy, but you've also got the Red Hair Pirates evoking Shanks, or even the Fire Tank Pirates honoring their meticulously well-built father. The new Fishman Pirates Jolly Roger is one of only 3 in the entire series that does not adhere to the standard. Their Jolly Roger is a decapitated human, which is because even though Hody is the captain, the crew isn't guided by him. They are guided by their desire to kill humans. And this is of course in direct contrast to the Sun Pirates, another of the 3 exceptions, who chose to embody the sun as their figurehead, signifying that they act for a greater future where fishermen can eventually live in peace under the sun. Neither crew exists for the individual, but for the idea. And what this means is that there just isn't a lot to grab onto with Hody himself. As an idea phantom, he is deliberately designed to lack a compelling personality. He doesn't have the charisma of a crocodile, the flamboyancy of a flamingo, or even the comic timing of a fox. Hody has no redeeming qualities, and that's a purposeful choice for the themes of the story that he was charged with telling, which he does really well. Although doing something well and being able to satisfy an audience are two different things, which we'll get to, but I will say that Hody being a phantom makes Luffy fighting with him so much more complicated than most antagonists. With your classics like Crocodile, Doflamingo, and Crocodile again, the clear solution has always been to punch them into submission and have a big old party afterwards. But you can't punch an idea. Or I guess you can punch the idea's vessel, but you only risk making that idea stronger. As Jinbei says, if Luffy, the person who beat Arlong, waltzed in with his rubber member swinging about and used it to beat Hody, then it could make things significantly worse. Because then it's another case of a human coming in to oppress any fishman who dared stand against them. Luffy beating Hody here would, yes, temporarily save the kingdom, but it would birth hundreds, perhaps even thousands of future Hodys. The flame of hatred would live on. So this situation needed to be handled as delicately as possible. And in a way, Hody is one of Luffy's toughest opponents, because simply beating him isn't enough. Something needs to be done to change the perspective of those around Hody before all of the punching happens, which for the people not on board with all of the ideas and themes only serves to slow the arc down. One of the most common criticisms of Fishman Island is that it takes too long, but it's only 51 chapters, which is shorter than the Enies Lobby arc. So I think the more accurate criticism would be that it doesn't take too long, but it does take too long to get to the parts that a lot of One Piece readers are looking for, aka the big lore drops and the action, because Fishman Island elects to spend most of its time setting up and exploring the deeper arc themes. But on top of that, when the action does happen, it comes with this familiar taste of disappointment. One of the trickiest Hody complaints is that he wasn't a challenge to the crew. Not a single one of them faced any real difficulty in their fight against the new Fishman pirates, and I get that. And this is where Hody falls into a bit of an awkward spot, because the first post-time skip arc was always going to be like this. The Straw Hats didn't train for 2 years to be pushed to their absolute limits by the very first ne'er-do-wells they came across, which is exactly what happened in East Blue. For the most part, that saga was a breeze, and Luffy wasn't pushed to his limits until Crocodile. The difference is that it's more forgivable because arcs in East Blue only last about a quarter of the length that Fishman Island was. So what we have here is a post-time skip sized arc with an East Blue caliber ending. Exploring deep ideas is great, but One Piece is also a shonen manga, and the standard formula, including the fights, are a huge reason why a lot of people read it. And I can absolutely understand how Hody didn't land in that regard, although I do think it would have been the same for any antagonist in his position. Whoever they encountered was always going to be wiped. It just happened to be Hody. So let's talk about drugs. Complaint number whatever we're up to with Hody is the energy steroids, which are kind of like going Sulong for fishmen. There's a general sense that they feel a bit cheap, as if Oda realized that the post-time skip Straw Hats weren't going to get a challenge, so it was thrown in for the sake of dramatic tension. That and an excuse to change Hody's design into something a bit more threatening. But I think that thematically, the energy steroids are pretty perfect. These drugs serve as a metaphor for Hody's ambition. First of all being that he lacks it. He has no substance within himself, so he needs an external substance to make up for that lack of substance. But also the idea of success, but at what cost and for what purpose? The answer being that there is no purpose and it's a huge cost. Great. That's just what Hody is. Everything he does is fabricate. Like when he fabricated hate towards humans by killing Otohime and blaming a human. Everything about him is a facade. So I think it's really on point that his physical power is also fake and granted to him artificially via fish pills. One Piece is a series where strength is directly conjured from willpower, drive, and desire. And Hody, he has none of those things, so of course his power needs to be artificial as well. Having brought up Otohime though, Hody is set up as the direct antithesis of Princess Shirahoshi. Right before the arc climax begins, Shirahoshi revealed that she'd always known it was Hody who killed her mother, but Shirahoshi refused to say anything because she made a promise to Otohime that, no matter who killed her, she wouldn't hate them. So you have Hody, a man who is the embodiment of hatred, being directly opposed by Shirahoshi, who is incapable of hate. Hody and Shirahoshi are two very well written sides of the same narrative coin. The existence of one directly makes the other stronger via juxtaposition. However, this doesn't necessarily make Hody a stronger character to many, because Shirahoshi is also an often complained about and misunderstood character, so having her as Hody's counterbalance is just adding another layer of polarization to the discussion. And then there's expectations. Something to remember is that back in the day, it's been a long time now, Fishman Island was an arc that came with more anticipation than any other, because we'd been talking about going there ever since the days of East Blue, and the goal was to get there after setting sail from Water 7. That was the intended destination before Thriller Bark, Sabadi, and then that big old wall got in the way. So it was a location built up for over a decade. The only other comparison I can really think of being Wano, which was an arc built up over a similar amount of time. And what we got from Wano was the sort of thing that people expected from Fishman Island, simply due to how long Oda had been teasing readers with it. So even though Oda delivered a great story with exceptionally well thought out characters, and again, easily the most unique villain in the series to this day, it wasn't what a lot of readers were looking for at the time. So look, I don't want to say that Hody Jones is too smart for One Piece because that sounds very pretentious, but at the same time, I do think that Hody was a little bit too smart of an idea for One Piece. He's what I describe as an intangible villain. He's a vessel for the idea. You can't view him as a character. He's a phantom. He's a living metaphor, and his role is written to perfection to express the idea that Oda wanted to put on page. So in a way, it's okay for him to be a forgettable and underwhelming villain, because he himself was never meant to make an impact. He was the Amazon delivery package that contains the thing it is you actually wanted, the idea. And Fishman Island was about overcoming the lingering ghosts of hatred within both Fishman and human society so we can move on to build a better world. Of course, that makes our ultimate task here very difficult, because as I've stated, I think that Hody Jones nailed exactly what Oda intended him to do. But he exists in a series of very different expectations. Readers go into One Piece arcs with certain expectations, many of which Hody did not meet, and he provided something different and unique, which was always going to be polarizing by nature. I, for example, really appreciate what Hody did, but I would never claim that he was one of my top favorite villains. In the end, he's less of a character and more of a thematic vehicle, which means that I don't think Hody can go any further than a C tier, because he's a fantastic, well-executed idea that came at the cost of his character. But you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Galdino, aka Mr. 3, aka I'm going to keep calling him Galdino because that's his name, and he's someone who I like to refer to as a stealth antagonist, because he puts in all the work, so much work, but it goes largely unnoticed by fans. But not today, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the man with the suspiciously semen-looking wax manipulation abilities, Galdino. So let's start with the idea that Galdino is a major antagonist whose themes are a bit too subtle for his arc. Because during his tenure as a major antagonist, one of the primary themes that he's employed to explore is culture. Galdino is introduced on Kuka Island, a vacation island, and one of the first things he expresses is the appreciation that he gets to go on ever so many luxury vacations, thanks to his status as an officer agent of Baroque Works. However, the very first thing he says is, you can't beat Earl Grey, which isn't a localization. In Japanese, Galdino also says Earl Grey, and it's meant to establish him as something of a snob. This might not come across in English because Earl Grey is your very standard tea brand. In fact, I was going to say I'm drinking it right now, but no, I'm drinking Twinnings or Twinings. I don't know. This might not come across in English because Earl Grey is your very basic tea brand, but in Japanese, it conveys a very different idea. It gives the sense that Galdino goes out of his way to source only the finest of English teas from abroad, especially since Japan already has its own incredibly prolific tea culture. So from the very get-go, we are painting Galdino as a man of rather refined tastes, or at the very least a man who would strongly argue in favor that his tastes are the best tastes. And we go on to establish that he is very quick to look down on others. After hearing the report of Mr. Five's death, Galdino performs an impromptu eulogy. He was an overambitious fool who didn't realize his own limitations. It takes hard work to possess the powers of evil. An overachiever who misuses them is pathetic. In the end, the superior criminal's greatest weapon is his brain. So Galdino sees himself as something of a high-class intellectual, a man whose sheer mental acuity has earned him the right to the finest of teas and the most luxurious of vacations between jobs. And he's also an example of a character where the Viz translation of the manga really enhances and suits him. The Viz translation often gets criticized for using overly florid language, but that actually works quite well in this case, because Galdino would always opt to speak the word less spoken. Galdino also gets easily frustrated by others who don't have an appreciation for the same things that he deems worthy, such as when his partner Miss Goldenweek says that she's bored on vacation. Galdino dismisses her as not having the finely tuned sense to identify and appreciate the luxury that they're meant to be enjoying. And this dismissive nature is also what leads Galdino to targeting the giant story in Brocky. Despite being on a mission to capture the Straw Hats, Galdino comes across an opportunity to claim a sweet 200 million berry bounty, which he believes he can easily achieve thanks to the idea that with a little creativity, and even the biggest mountain can be made to crumble. He very clearly and ironically looks down on the giants, which is interesting because he goes on to explain their history as well as how notorious and legendary they were over 100 years ago. But everything he knows, all of those facts do not bother him, because Galdino sees himself as so intellectually superior to the primitive culture of the giants that he cannot possibly lose. There is nothing these hulking savages could do to counter Galdino's superior of mind brains. Which again, this is one of the key themes of Little Garden, being culture. We explore two completely opposing cultures through the neutral eyes of the Straw Hats. Vivi actually puts it very well when she explains the grand line. Some cultures are very advanced, others have stayed unchanged for thousands of years, with both Little Garden and Elbaf representing the latter, and it can be quite a shock, considering that our introduction to the giants is where we see Brocky brutally decapitate a dinosaur and raise its severed head in glorious victory. Of course, Little Garden as an island also plays into this, because it's untamed, raw, and natural, an area of the world completely free of the influence of mankind. And that's why Oda chose Galdino to be its enemy. Oda doesn't choose arc antagonists on a whim, and I think Galdino often seems a bit mismatched at first, because on paper it's like, okay, let's send the Candleman to the dinosaur island. Lol, random. It's not an immediately obvious contrast. And I think that does very much work against Galdino's appreciation in the fanbase, but he is the perfect antagonist for an arc like this. The ultimate antagonist to a proud race of ancient warriors is, of course, the modern elitist wanker, a man who will always claim to be cultured, but that culture is hollow and superficial. One side lives to embody the well-established beliefs of their people, and the other side lives to arbitrarily construct tier list of which teas are the best and considered the most upper class. To be fair to Galdino, his tastes are quite good, because his tea even manages to seduce Sanji, and Sanji even compliments the decor of Galdino's wax house. So it's not like Galdino's completely out of his mind. He does understand and appreciate the finer things, he just places far too much value on them, and dismisses everything else too immediately. Between Galdino and the giants, neither culture is capable of understanding the other, and something that I really like about Galdino is that he initially targets the giants by planting a bomb in a barrel of ale, which could not be more the opposite of how an Elbafian giant would handle a conflict. They take pride in entering battle head on, whereas Galdino is searching for victory without even fighting, because that would be the disgusting working class way of doing things. Oh my god. And our friend Galdino is a very white glove officer. Quite literally at one point where he constructs white wax gloves for himself. And you'll notice that during Little Garden, Galdino goes out of his way not to touch anyone. Not out of respect for their personal space, but because he quite literally does not want to sully his hands with the oils of the poor lower class swine. He's very akin to a world noble in that regard, as well as several other regards. Going back on Galdino is a weird experience, because in the beginning he is a properly sadistic madman who desires to torture and kill people in the most unique and ornate ways possible to produce art, which I think is both a good and a bad thing for his character. The good thing is that artist villains are intrinsically interesting, or at least I think so. And it's because they often have unique motivations or uncommon desires of expression. They don't have your typical standard boring villain goals of wealth, fame, and power. Instead, artists are often striving to create something horrifying to evoke some sort of feeling that puts them on a whole different level of disturbing to most antagonists. Their goals aren't always fulfilled in logical steps. They're much more abstract and unpredictable, which is why I find them fascinating. And this does fit Galdino quite well, as he constructed this ornate wax candelabra designed to suffocate Vivi, Zoro, and Nami in the most complicated way possible. And Galdino's motivation as an artist is then stated, "Agony is the look I seek. Let your bodies become monuments to horror." And then he says a whole bunch of other bad words. He's striving to do bad things. And all in all, this is a pretty dark idea for One Piece. Earlier, Galdino also says that another reason why he's doing this is because his wax skills cannot create such perfect human figures. So he has to use real human bodies to properly capture the soul of the horror of humanity. And the idea reminds me a lot of Fourth Prince Cyrodiilic from Hunter x Hunter. And because this is a One Piece video, I'm not going to go into the specifics of his art, but what he seeks is the moment where the potential of humanity is snuffed out and realizes that it's all over. Hunter x Hunter is also a much darker series than One Piece, and that's where I think Galdino's concept stumbles a bit. The psychotic artist is a really interesting idea for an antagonist, but only when you are willing to properly commit to it. And Galdino feels very shallow, as if the idea is introduced, and then he spends the rest of Little Garden becoming a very stereotypical over-the-top cartoon villain who doesn't at all capitalize on his established potential. And on some level, I can appreciate that, because it may even be intentional, to show how hollow and frankly what a basic bitch he is, after promising such intellectual prowess and creativity. So he's a character designed to be underwhelming, but the character designed to be underwhelming is still going to be underwhelming underwhelming, especially compared to his partner Miss Goldenweek, and I think this is intentional as well, but she is, by every measurable metric, a far superior artist to Galdino. With her colors traps painting abilities, she actually has the power to influence people's emotions on an extreme level, which is what most modern art strives for, to create an emotional response within the viewer. So Galdino, he's over here creating all sorts of highly detailed sculptures with all sorts of well thought out processes, but it's not really accomplishing much. Then we look over here, there's Ms. Goldenweek, and what she does right is she paints a circle. And my God, the circle is brilliant. It is a stronger artistic expression. And the worst part is that she's not even trying. Miss Goldenweek is your classic carried by talent artist. She has a natural X factor that no amount of pursuit of his craft could ever allow Galdino to overcome. And Miss Goldenweek doesn't even realize her own talent. She just wants to eat crackers. And for one final insult, Miss Goldenweek isn't even a devil fruit user. Her power is produced through her painting skills alone. So it's completely natural talent. Unlike Galdino's devil fruit granted wax abilities that he's wasting, doing exactly what he accused Mr. 5 of doing. He was an overambitious fool who didn't realize his own limitations. Honestly, I'd even make the argument that Dory and Broggy are better artists than he is. Because fighting for 100 years straight, mate, that is one hell of a durational performance piece. That is going down in history books. The wax candle crap, it's not going anywhere, except the bin. And of course, it gets even more insulting because cutting forward a bit, during Impel Down, Luffy mentions that he forgot Galdino could even use wax powers, which gives us an idea of just how impactful Galdino's art ultimately was, which was not. All of which I'm on board with. I don't mind exploring the concept of the failed artist, but something I'm really not a fan of with Galdino is how he concludes his time on Little Garden by constructing a wax mech, because the design is really cool, wacky, and fun, but the conflict becomes very generic, and in fact, Galdino more or less ends up becoming Don Krieg with lines like, "In this form, I am already invincible. My special wax gently envelops me in a carapace that's harder than steel, and there's no weak point in this armor." So he definitely has the whole Krieg complex going on, putting on his indestructible armor and believing that, he's invincible because of it, which I just don't think works as well for this character. It worked really well for Don Krieg, not for Galdino. And then resorting to a fist fight with Luffy is very much at odds with Galdino's philosophy of intellectual superiority. And Oda knew that, which is why the true ending to the fight is Galdino trying to mentally outplay Luffy one last time with the Wax Mansion, which I think is a heavily underrated ending. A lot of people don't realize that this technique and its flaw are a callback to what Galdino said earlier. Not even my skill in the wax arts could create such perfect human figures. So he thinks he's outsmarting Luffy, this dumbass, by creating all of these wax decoys. Sure, his statues aren't perfect, but he's too stupid to notice. But Luffy's natural instinct is able to immediately tell who the real one is. And it's not just because Galdino's human sculptures are flawed, but just like Miss Goldenweek, it's because Luffy has that natural talent. And no matter how hard Galdino tries, he will not be able to overcome that because he just doesn't have that flair, the inner flame of an artist burning brightly. And Oda choosing to end Little Garden this way saves the character for me, because for a while there, this was looking like it was in danger of becoming a very standard shonen fistfight. However, not ending in that standard way is also what I think makes Galdino a bit less memorable when compared to other villains in the minds of general fans, because what it boils down to on paper is a kick in the face with very little resistance, and really the whole ordeal can barely be called a fight. And I also think it can be argued that Oda simply did not commit enough to the concept. Galdino's whole artist-villain thing, it didn't really work, it kind of did, but that's why the ending to it didn't really land. And when going through Little Garden for the first time, I know that Galdino to me felt like a bit of a villain of the week. A pretty unique concept explored in a so-so way. It doesn't really matter. Next week, we'll hope for something better. And I guess the next week of One Piece would be Warpole, so I don't know if what we go is better. But luckily for Galdino, he is going to get some pretty major plus points, and it's all thanks to his post-antagonist arc. Firstly, he does briefly return during Alabasta to face his boss, Sir Crocodile, who gives Galdino some very harsh truths. Mr. 3, do you know why I gave you that position? Do you? You're not strong like Mr. 4, but I thought what you lacked in brawn you'd make up for with your ruthlessness. But you disappoint me. There's nothing more pathetic than someone who fails at the crucial moment, which is almost like a meta commentary on his role as a villain. He was genuinely disappointing. Like Crocodile, I had high expectations for this ruthlessness, but said ruthlessness just turned out to be uselessness. However, this is exactly where we need the character to be. This is Galdino hitting rock bottom, and the sad thing is that after Alabasta, he tried to go back to his vacation island during Miss Goldenweek's cover story, but he was captured by the Marines and then sent to Impel Down. So he was now stripped of everything, including his clothes, because they took them off him and gave him the fancy striped prison outfit. And look, as cruel as it may be, I think that Galdino needed to experience the hell of Impel Down to be able to change. Remember that Galdino had these world noble tendencies. He really was not far away from a full-blown god complex. So being humbled by the earth was simply not enough. He needed to experience hell. And when we meet Galdino again, he has been literally starved of his arrogance. He no longer looks down on anyone because he is at the very bottom. And he becomes a much more likable, almost humble character who I genuinely started to root for. Despite the fact that he was still undermining us, however, the decision to pair him up with Buggy was masterful by Oda. Creating a duo out of these two flashy but substance-lacky figures had such a compound effect on comedy in this arc. And when everything is said and done, you can, and I will, make the argument that Galdino was the MVP of the entire Paramount War saga. During Impel Down, he was integral to the breakout by leading the prisoners alongside Buggy. He was also the one who saved everyone's lives by briefly countering Magellan's poison with his wax. And then during the Paramount War, Galdino was the one who made the key to free Ace. He's absolutely one of the most underappreciated characters in One Piece, because if you take him out of the series, then everything falls apart during the Paramount War saga. And the way I'd describe this era of Galdino is like a stagehand, someone who is integral to the smooth running of a show, but remains largely unnoticed in the wings of the theater. And this is the panel that I think sums up Galdino best. You might not even see him at first, but this is from chapter 216, where Galdino has a painfully small cameo listening to Vivi's speech at Rainbase, which is an appearance that I didn't even notice until about a decade after originally reading it. He's there, but he blends in so perfectly that he doesn't stand out. There's lots of subtleties. Like when he made Luffy wax gear to fight Magellan. This is a callback to when Galdino made his own armor on Little Garden, and Luffy reacted with his classic starry cool eyes. And I love Luffy's dialogue here. I don't know why, but this brings a tear to my eye. Thank you. Thanks for making me look so cool. I just love that little moment because it is a proper full circle on the Luffy-Galdino relationship. From enemies to allies, and the stuff that he thought was cool on Galdino, he now gets to wear. But I do think the best way to show Galdino's growth as a character is also during Impel Down when he stops Magellan with a wax ball, and then we cut to a panel of Crocodile smiling and saying, you never know how one power will work against another, which is kind of like Galdino's version of finally having his father's approval. The last time they met, Crocodile ran out of words in the dictionary to describe just how much of a failure Galdino was. But now things have changed, and that smile on Crocodile, that one right there, that is one proud wax daddy. And then cut to the modern day. Against all odds, Galdino has become a character who will be present as an officer of an Emperor of the Sea in the final saga of One Piece. He is such an underdog. Most fans probably forget that he even exists, but he's busy making his mark on this world whether you notice it or not. And that is exactly what a true artist would do. True artists are not concerned with fame, fortune, and luxury holidays. And after being stripped of all of that, Galdino became free to pursue his work in its purest form. He ignited that artistic flame that he was missing on Little Garden. And I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I think that considering all of that makes him a B-tier One Piece villain. He started out with a great contrasting idea to fit the themes of Little Garden. Yes, there was a bit of a fumble executing the idea, but then we were right back on that wax horse afterwards to give Galdino a full character arc, which not all One Piece villains get. In fact, most of them do not. And you let me know in the comments which of those villains you'd like to see ranked next. This is Monkey D. Luffy. He's had a rough 2 years separated from the Straw Hats, gained a little weight, and developed a crippling alcohol addiction, but I'm pretty sure this is him. And even if I'm not, he certainly did have the world convinced because in reality, gasp, this is three-tongued Damaro Black, a villain whose run starts and concludes within the span of 5 chapters, which sounds way too short to make a full video on, but I have always been a huge fan of this guy. I think the fan base impression of him as being a complete joke, and that's not entirely wrong. But Oda put so much work into every aspect of Damaro Black, work that goes unnoticed. He represents a lot of clever ideas, masked by an impenetrable layer of blubber, but today we will penetrate. Because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the Luffy we have at home, Damaro Black, who I should say is a very tricky antagonist to rank, because what he does is he fills the void that Luffy left when he went off to go training with big animals during the 2-year time skip, which left Luffy's identity up for grabs, and it was grabbed by this, this. And the primary idea behind this villain is to explore how the world sees Luffy. We as readers and watchers see Luffy as this pure being being, in it for the adventure, the friends, and the dreams. But that's not how characters within the One Piece world view Luffy. Because according to all of the world government and Big Bird propaganda, Luffy is an evil being, ruthlessly pillaging and trying to destroy global stability because he's a dick. So in world, Tomorrow Black is actually far more accurate to how the citizens of the One Piece planet view Luffy. A very bad man doing all sorts of very bad man things, like destroying any slobby, breaking the Impel Down prisoners out, to wreak havoc on the world, and all the way up to modern day, when it was reported that he took Dr. Vegapunk hostage. What a fiend. So you meet Tomorrow Black, and yeah, it seems like he's capable of doing all of these horrific things. And he also fits the profile of a more stereotypical pirate. So if you're a random dude in One Piece, it's very easy to believe that he is who he says he is. And that's why, as ridiculous of a caricature as he is, the world accepts Tomorrow Black in the role of Luffy. And it's not just random citizens who vaguely keep up with the news. Even the Marines believe that this guy is the real deal. A couple of them comment that, hey, Luffy looks a little bit different, doesn't he? But no, that can't be right. This is definitely Straw Hat Luffy. And this often gets neglected, but it needs to be said how much Tomorrow Black didn't just fool the citizens and the Marines, but also fellow pirates. At his recruitment gathering, we have a pirate admiring him, stating, "It's like a dream come true. The infamous pirate who wreaked havoc on the 3 greatest facilities of the world government, Enisobi, Impel Down, and Navy headquarters," which shows just how much of an inspiration Luffy is, not just to the kind-hearted people of the world, but also to the various nefarious villains of the world. They see his infamy as reported by the world government, and they go, "Mate, good job. One day, I hope to be as much of a prick as he is." And I don't know if this is the right word, but Tomorrow Black is like a reflection of Luffy. Everything's kind of the same, but it's all flipped and wrong. Or maybe a shadow cast by Luffy. Something that sort of resembles him, but is much more abstract. Which means that Tomorrow Black has very unique criteria for success in this video, which is that to judge how good of a villain he is, we need to determine just how well he does his job of contrasting Luffy, as well as the ultimate goal of Luffy taking back his identity and his glorious return to form. And just briefly on that, he's not introduced in the manga as Tomorrow Black. Eiichiro Oda introduces him as Captain Monkey D. Luffy and crew. He does that to the readers through a narration box. So even Oda is acknowledging that in this world right now, this is Luffy and the Straw Hats. So let's talk aesthetics. To his credit, it does look like Tomorrow Black did actually scar himself to take on the role of Luffy, but to give him less credit, he got it completely wrong. I mean, he tried, but it was the easiest possible thing to get right. The scar under the face. Luffy has 2 vertical lines, but for whatever reason, Tomorrow Black did 3. He also has an X-shaped scar on his stomach, which is notable because Tomorrow Black would not have known about Luffy's X-shaped scar on his chest. So there's some coincidental attention to detail there. And all in all, yeah, it's a comically lazy effort to cosplay Luffy. But what Oda does with his personality is sculpted to misshapen perfection. And Tomorrow Black's actions are a callback to many of the most iconic moments in One Piece. The most obvious one is when fake Robin and her real Cucumber get captured. And remember that Luffy declared war on the world government and invaded Enisobi just to get Robin back. And later on, he invaded Whole Cake Island to get Sanji back. There is nothing that Luffy wouldn't do for a member of his crew. But when Tomorrow Black hears that Robin was captured by Cypherpole agents, he more or less says, who cares? We have like 100 of those pirate things already. We don't need her. So that contrast is pretty easy to spot. But there are much more subtle as well as much more powerful callbacks as well. One of the most iconic moments in One Piece will always be Jaya, when Luffy and Zoro were beaten by Bellamy and his pirates in the Mocktown Bar. It's a fantastic showcase of how much Luffy has grown to take on the philosophy of Shanks, who had the same thing happen to him in Chapter 1 at the hands of Hickman the Bear, which is a sign of maturity. Figures like Luffy and Shanks don't raise their fists over minor issues. In the words of Shanks, "You can pour drinks on me, you can throw food at me, you can even spit on me. I'll just laugh that stuff off. But good reason or not, nobody hurts a friend of mine." And speaking of spitting, there's a pretty rank part of Jaya where Bellamy spits his drink out at Luffy and Zoro, and they still do nothing. Because so what? Bellamy and his crew aren't actually threatening them, so they can mock all they like because he's not a threat to their friends or their dreams. Now cut to Tomorrow Black, and he is the complete opposite, because the same thing happened to him on Sabadi. He gets beaten up in a bar by Nami and Usopp, and instead of laughing it off and moving on, Tomorrow Black takes great offense at this act, and revenge becomes his main driving force. Because status is the only substance he possesses, he is all about that superficial respect. Unlike Luffy and Shanks, he doesn't have anything to fall back on. So he gathers his forces and he states, "I summoned you here for one reason. Your precious big boss," that's me, "has been insulted by a bunch of nobodies. They're still somewhere on the island. Find 'em and bring 'em to me." So TLDR bro got his feelings hurt, and he couldn't laugh it off. I mean, mate, this guy could never be a joy boy. He is a very sad boy. And the fact that Damara Black even has extended forces is another masterstroke by Oda. After Luffy picking up his Straw Hats, one of the very first panels we see in the post-time skip era is a poster stating that the Straw Hats are recruiting, that notorious Captain Monkey D. Luffy is indeed alive, and they plan to expand their crew in order to plunder the New World. Essentially, Damara Black is trying to build his own grand fleet, and he's doing it a whole 200 chapters before Luffy would have the opportunity to do the same thing. So what Oda's done here is show a contrast between Damara Black and Luffy that we don't even know about yet, because when given this opportunity, Luffy declines the Grand Fleet offer, stating that it'll cramp my style, which all has to do with the philosophy of freedom. Luffy doesn't want to be tied down to these forces, and he doesn't want these forces to be tied to him. That's just not freedom. But Damara Black has to tie other people to him. He doesn't have what it takes to be a decent force in the New World, so whether he realizes it or not, Damara Black is adopting the Buggy model of using his status to have much stronger people fight on his behalf. So he's following in the footsteps of a literal clown, and Buggy isn't the only antagonist that Damara Black embodies, because I think he more strongly resembles Blackbeard, another character who is set up to be an antithesis of Luffy, because you can sum both Damara Black and Damara Blackbeard up in 3 words, those words being guns, booze, and women. Damara Black and Blackbeard are both notorious drunkards who favor excessive use of firearms, which is relevant because Luffy never uses guns. Not in the canon material anyway. He's held and even fired guns in color spreads before, and he has used firearms in non-canon media like the Strong World film, when the Straw Hats burst into Shiki's base and started just massacring everyone, my god. To me, that was always such a weird choice that they made, because here's what would happen if Luffy got a gun. It would be the same thing as what happened when he used the Nidai Kitetsu. He would grab the gun and then just keep punching people whilst holding the gun. In regards to women, Luffy has no concept of sexuality. However, Damara Black is very physically motivated. The first real Straw Hat that he encounters is Nami, who is coincidentally drinking at the same bar as him. So Damara Black sees her, puts on some Straw Hat jelly belly swagger, and makes a move on her. But Nami rejects him with a sentence that I find hilarious. "No thanks, I'm waiting for a man, and you are not that." I added that last bit in because I feel like it's implied. Nami also says, "I'll tell you one more time, I'm not going to drink with you. You're not good enough for me." Meanwhile, when Usopp rocks up on the next page, he gets an immediate face full of boob, showing us that the fakest of Luffys aren't even the fraction of a man that the realest of Usopps are. Damara Black is a podium character. He's a stage element that exists so that other characters can step on him and look better. In this case, Damara Black's first defeat is handed to him by Nami and Usopp. This is important because Nami and Usopp have always been portrayed as the weakest Straw Hats. On one occasion, Oda even stated that he always intends for Usopp to remain the weakest crew member. So Damara Black is a podium to show just how far Nami and Usopp have come. That this fake Luffy, who isn't weak by the way, he's a pretty decently powerful pirate, it's just that Nami and Usopp have come so far in their 2 years of training that the bar for Straw Hat has been raised impossibly out of grasp for the average pirate. And the idea is that if Nami and Usopp have grown this much, then just imagine how powerful everyone else has become. And it's all thanks to Mr. Podium. And while we've explored how Damara Black embodies the traits of established antagonists like Blackbeard and Buggy, there's an even more important antagonistic force that he definitely evokes. There's a point during the Return to Sabaody arc where Damara Black shoots innocent civilians for seemingly no good reason. He states that it's because he was searching for people who looked like those citizens, but he doesn't particularly care, and he even goes on to shoot the other person just because he can. He feels entitled to because of his status as Straw Hat Luffy. The word entitled being very important because this scene is eerily similar to how St. Charlos behaved in the original Sabaody arc. Charlos also encountered a couple and shot the man because he wanted to take the woman as one of his numerous slave wives. And just what were all of the rest of the Straw Hats doing while this was occurring, you ask? Well, in that very same chapter, Chopper was busy getting high with a starfish. So well done, Chopper, well done. But I honestly don't see a huge difference between Charlos and Damara Black in these respective moments. Both of them feel that their status gives them the right to treat people like objects and toy with them as they like. And in each case, it's unearned status as well, which is what completes Damara Black as the antithesis of Luffy, because the will of D is the enemy of the gods, aka the world nobles. So for Damara Black to truly contrast Luffy, Oda gave him the qualities of a budget-constrained world noble. But that doesn't stop him focusing on numbers, mate. He is all about numbers. For example, when a pirate worth 55 million berries tries to join his crew, Damara Black goes, "Nah mate," and shoots him. Read the notice one more time. "I only want people with bounties of at least 70 million berries. We're not accepting any captains below that level. I'm surprised you made it this far with a measly bounty like that." And I'd just like to point out that Damara Black's actual bounty is 26 million berries, so it's not even half of the bounty of the pirate that he shot. He even makes fake Frankie his bookkeeper to really hammer home those numbers, keeping track of all of the recruits and their individual bounties, he doesn't care about their qualities. What he sees are products with a price tag. Again, in the same way that the world nobles view anyone who isn't them. And to complete this comparison, Damaro Black is so supremely focused on lineage, even if it's fake lineage. On multiple occasions, he proudly claims to be the son of Dragon the Revolutionary. In fact, I'm almost certain that Damaro Black has said Dragon's name more in the 5 chapters he appears in than Luffy has in the entire rest of the series. Later on, Damaro Black also adds that he is the grandson of Garp and has a 400 million berry bounty, putting a lot of weight onto his fake lineage that's supposed to grant him a divine right to rule over others. With all of that said, he does have one thing in common with Luffy, which is that Damaro Black also cannot recognize people in mediocre disguises. Damaro Black literally runs into the real Luffy, the man he's supposed to have studied to take on his identity. He even gets uncomfortably face-to-face close with Luffy and doesn't even begin to put those mental puzzle pieces together. And at the same time, the real Luffy doesn't recognize that Damaro Black is trying to be him. It's a very fun interaction of two people claiming to be the same person, but having no idea that that's what the other one's actually doing. I also want to point out that Damaro Black fits perfectly into the extended themes of Sabaody and the groundwork that both of those arcs lay for Egghead Island. It's very appropriate to explore the idea of copies and identities in an arc and at a location known for the first appearance of the Pacifista, who are copies of Bartholomew Kuma, albeit much more successful copies than Damaro Black is of Luffy. There's also something to be said that Sentomaru is one of the only people who recognizes that, mate, this is not Luffy, which I like because Sentomaru is the Kuma clone wrangler. He has an eye for detail and can tell them all apart and can also do the same for Luffy, even though he's only met Luffy once. And look, it's not a major thread. I'm not going to claim that Damaro is some sort of masterpiece because of this. I just think it's worth noting how Oda meticulously groups these thematic elements together. But when everything is said and done, as well constructed as he is, Damaro Black is undeniably a gag villain. And while those aren't uncommon in One Piece, it is extremely rare for them to be the major arc antagonist. In fact, the only other example I can think of that happening is Foxy, but as a result, Damaro Black cannot be judged based simply on the basic criteria. For example, at no stage was he ever a threat. His motivation is pretty bland. He's too pathetic of a character to be compelling. He has no character arc, and he doesn't even have a particularly satisfying end either. Sentomaru thwacks him with an axe, he gets caught, and that's the last we've heard of him, which I think is a shame because there is so much potential for a cover story or a B-plot that focuses on the fake Straw Hats. They definitely fall into the category of wacky villains that don't quite hold their own arcs, but would make phenomenal side characters. But that is a fail for every category I would normally use to judge an antagonist. Theoretically, Damaro Black should be the worst villain in the series, and yet he isn't. I think what really saves Damaro Black is that he did not overstay his welcome. He got in and out in 5 chapters quickly and efficiently, performing all of his required functions, of which there were many, as we've explored. So he wasn't a haphazardly written goofball. He had a clear purpose to embody the direct antithesis of what Luffy is, as well as to become a bit of a petri dish of everything we're fighting against in this world. So it's honestly difficult not to call him a resounding success. It's just that his success, well, it wasn't very narratively ambitious. And I think characters should be rewarded for taking on higher challenges, even if they don't succeed at those more difficult challenges as much as Damaro Black did with his easy difficulty setting. The bar for success was very low, but Damaro Black well and truly cleared it. And I think the most appropriate tier for someone that I would describe as underwhelming but very proficient would be a middling C tier. Now, one thing I should add is that this video was recorded and edited before chapter 1115 came out, which gave me exactly what I wanted, exactly what I felt was missing, which was the return of Damaro Black. Except with his official spelling now being Damalo, and instead of Luffy, he is now pretending to be Eustace Captain Kidd, which is a development that I love. It's not one that's really going to change the outcome of his positioning on this tier list, but I need it on the record that this man and his crew are still active, and I hope that we continue to follow his insanity well into the future. I definitely think that he could have been more, but he isn't, and here we are. Or in this specific case, here we were. Because the best thing about Damaro Black is that he and the fake Straw Hats have their own theme song called We Were, which is a very poorly sung rendition of the classic intro, We Are. But you let me know in the comments which antagonist you'd like to see ranked next. This is Gecko Moria. This elephantine long-necked gothic Batman is the primary antagonist of Thriller Bark, whose genuinely fascinating and well-implemented ideas are masked by controversial aesthetics and an impression of general failure. Even I, man on the internet, am not immune to this, and I often construct humorous statements at Moria's expense. But today, I am going to give you the fairest Gecko Moria video on the internet, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video. This this time featuring the tragic, the lazy, and the criminally misunderstood Gecko Moria. I'm not going to waste any time with this one. Gecko Moria is weird, and Oda did his absolute best to ease you into that weirdness. Going through Thriller Bark is a bit like going through a haunted house at a carnival. It has that blend of scary yet wacky, because the goal of a haunted house is to use fear in a fun way, which is why Oda chooses Nami, Usopp, and Chopper to be the characters to initially step through Thriller Bark, the most comically over-the-top, easy-to-scare crew members, reacting to all of these absurd dancing, zombies, ghosts, and trees. Honestly, I think this arc is Oda at his most creative, because every new page you turn results in something crazy happening, like a person coming out of a painting, a living bear rug, or ghosts that just make you feel like really bad about your current life circumstances, you know? This is a marked step up of wacky in One Piece, and all of it is because Oda is preparing you for something even more crazy. This is not going to be your standard cool, powerful villain guy, and it's not going to be your standard motivation for a villain either. No, Oda's priming you for something more of an acquired taste, because when the story waiter comes to your table, he takes off the cloche and reveals Gecko Moria, you're gonna need to have a pretty open mind about trying it. And I really love Moria's teaser introduction where we see this colossal figure lying in darkness. All we see of his face are eyes and teeth, which is very similar to Big Mom's introduction. And I think that both of them are equally as effective in giving us a sense of overwhelming power, like this nightmare lurking in the shadows that we need to be afraid of. However, I can't quite say the same for Moria's official introduction, which is pretty plain for a One Piece villain. He's just sitting there and all of that fear and mystery that was so carefully crafted in the teaser immediately dissipates for me personally. Now, I should say there is a good reason for this underwhelming introduction, which has to do with Moria's core themes, which we'll get into in a bit. However, a big part of why Moria's introduction doesn't hit me quite as hard as many others is because of his design. It's quite immersion breaking because I find myself wondering less who is this guy, and more why did the author choose to draw someone who looks like this guy? Initially, it takes me out of the experience. Although that's very subjective, I do not expect everyone to feel the same way. But what is consistent is that Gecko Moria's character design is out there even by One Piece standards. Gecko Moria seems like an idea that Oda was never quite sold on, and we went through some pretty drastic redesigns during his conceptualization. So what you're looking at now right here is the original Gecko Moria. He was supposed to be a pastor with a split personality. Ooh, interesting, but he looks a bit too plain. So then Oda gave Moria a much more elaborate and mysterious design by turning him into this terrifying man in a mask before going effort and creating this misshapen monster who is implied to be cobbled together out of other body parts due to all of the stitches and stuff. And that eventually got turned into the Moria we know today. Ichiro Oda's vision for Gecko Moria was very inconsistent and arguably not really existent, especially when you compare it to the original Doflamingo and Mihawk designs that are featured alongside Moria. And I'm not convinced that Oda ever had a strong idea for him. Of all of the warlords, Moria feels like, oh mate, I need a seventh one of those dudes. Why did I choose 7? Should have been the 6 warlords. And then what Oda does is he picks up all of the scraps he's left on the floor and like smooshes them together in a bowl to create Gecko Moria. However, I think that Oda does a pretty good job at turning Moria into something very interesting. Rather unusually, Gecko Moria is also introduced with his own personal motto, which I'm not sure if that's ever happened before or since Moria, but it's very important that we know this from the get-go. Gecko Moria's philosophy is, you do it, although he sums it up much more eloquently later in the arc. In the past, I was too full of ambition and overconfident in my own abilities, but then I realized how important it was to have superior underlings. I will never do anything on my own again. I'll become the Pirate King simply by using the help of others. So Gecko Moria is the kind of person who believes that he can change the world by tweeting about something that he doesn't like, and then hoping it'll pick up enough traction for someone to actually go and do something about it. And really, Gecko Moria doesn't actually do much of anything during Thriller Bark, with the exception of piloting oars in the very final and very short fight. He does almost literally nothing, and that is by design. Design or not, I actually found it quite difficult to write this video, because generally I speak about how actions enforce these villains, and in this case, Moria's tale is one of inaction. For example, when the Straw Hats invade Thriller Bark, Moria somehow finds a way to do even less than he was already doing, which was nothing, and he finds an even more prone position to be in. And then when finally pushed into doing a thing, his main method of combat is to put on his hidden leaf forehead protector, then scream Kagebunshin no Jutsu, and create literal shadow clones to fight on his behalf. But there is a very sound reason for this lazy philosophy, which is that in the past, being super active and overly overly ambitious cost Gecko Moria everything. Moria was present at Roger's execution, and he was one of the original captains to set sail in the great age of piracy. At one point, believe it or not, Gecko Moria was a frontrunner to find the One Piece and become the next pirate king. However, his dreams were unceremoniously crushed in the New World when the Gecko pirates fought Kaido and the Beast pirates on Wano. I mean, just think about that for a second. Gecko Moria made it all the way to Wano. That is pretty damn far in the New World, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. But Kaido and the Beast pirates massacred Moria's entire crew, leaving only Moria himself alive, and the mental devastation of that event caused Moria's fixation on creating zombies, because he simply could not bring himself to lose more friends. So instead, he turned to disposable crew members with no emotional attachment. But losing to Kaido was a huge shock to Moria himself, who clubbed him in the face with the reality of his own weakness, making him unwilling to personally participate in combat in the future. That's because deep down, Gecko Moria knows that he will never be strong enough to become the Pirate King. So the logic there is, if I can't ever do it, then why do anything at all? Instead, why not acquire the shadows of some people much more stronger than I to fight for me? So while it is tempting to write Gecko Moria off as being lazy, that's really not the case. From his point of view, he has no other option, and what he's doing is actually working smarter, not harder, which is a cool idea, definitely unique for One Piece, but I don't think it really takes shape during Thriller Bark itself, which is where it really needed to. One big issue is that Moria's story is directly tied to Kaido, a character who at that stage we knew nothing about except for his name and a terribly drawn silhouette. So the Moria appreciation tends to come a lot later in the story, which is not amazing. I mean, I think it's great to continue to get more depth about characters after they've served their main roles. For example, Whitebeard. I was thrilled to find out more about him in the Oden flashback, but I was also 100% satisfied by his role during the Marineford arc, where he was fully fleshed out, and then everything else down the line was a bonus. Moria is kind of the opposite. His flesh comes much later down the line, and Thriller Bark shows us the bonus remains of what was once a very ambitious man-thing. Most villains in One Piece are designed to provide a direct contrast to Luffy in their own unique areas, like how Don Krieg is willpower versus firepower, Buggy challenges Luffy's philosophy on treasure, and Damaro Black is the complete antithesis to everything that is Luffy. In Moria's case, that contrast is active ambition versus passive ambition, because to his credit, Gecko Moria has not given up on his dream. He's decided to pursue it just through a different path. It's creative, I like it. He's doing a passive run of One Piece in parallel to Luffy's run, and the perfect page to show the difference between them is when Luffy comes across Moria for the first time. Luffy's there, he's ready, he's active, he is going to beat up this Moria man with his own hands to take all of the shadows back and go on to achieve his dreams, hurrah! And then there's Gecko Moria right next to him, bigger in every way bar ambition, and he actively refuses to lift even a single finger in his effort to become the Pirate King. In this moment, Gecko Moria is a glorified Snorlax lying in the way of our game progress, and Luffy does not appreciate it. This panel right here is the unstoppable force versus the immovable rock. Whose ideology is going to prevail? Luffy's, obviously, because he's the main character, but there's also some great commentary on what it takes to have the qualities of a captain and the idea of obedience in general. When Moria first inserts Luffy's shadow into Oars, the first thing Moria tells him is that he is now his underling, and Oars with Luffy's shadow replies, "Underling? No way! I have a dream. This place is stuffy and boring. I'm gonna go outside. I'll set sail around the world." And Moria insists that the shadow will eventually lose the tendencies of its original owner, and it will become completely obedient to him. I would say that the battle on Thriller Bark takes place more within and against Oars than it does against Moria, which is both metaphorically and literally true. We spend so much time fighting Oars, much more than Moria. But it's a question of willpower. Will Luffy's shadow submit to Gecko Moria and effectively make Luffy give up on his dream, or will Luffy's ambition endure its greatest test to date? The answer is no, the ambition would not endure, apparently, and Luffy was forced to give up on his dream, at least Shadow Luffy was, because Oars does eventually succumb and accept Moria as his master, which leads to this fascinating conversation between Luffy and Oars, which is essentially a conversation between Luffy and himself. Luffy can't believe what Oars is saying, and he now has to physically fight a representation of himself to prove his ambition, or else, just like his shadow, it's going to be stolen from him by Gecko Moria, who will submit the Straw Hats to the same pain, loss, and destruction of dreams as he was subject to. To a lesser extent, Gecko Moria is also designed to contrast Brook, because this is his Straw Hat character arc. Both Moria and Brook are characters who represent the idea of stagnation. Both are former pirate captains who lost their entire crew in very tragic ways, and have ended up occupying this space in the Florian Triangle together, unable to move on, with the sole difference between them being willpower. Because one, Moria is stagnant by choice, choice, and the other, Brook, is stagnant by circumstance. He wants to go, but he can't get free. Whereas Gecko Moria, he can go free, but he doesn't want to go. And it's quite depressing because Brook describes his life as follows. 50 years in these dark waters. It was so long, and it was all for nothing. So desolate, my life was so dreary. But despite that, Brook had the will to endure. His loss made him stronger, but Moria's loss made him weaker. It scarred him from participating in conflict, and it led him to retreating to the darkest corner of the world, where no scary Kaidos could ever come to hurt him again. So here Oda presents us with two very different ways of dealing with tragedy, and also a very stern warning for events to come. I wouldn't say this is a favorable comparison, but I also consider Moria to be the Don Krieg of the Grand Line, because ultimately his character serves as a warning for the new world. Someone with ambition who set out to a higher level of sea was utterly decimated and forced to retreat. In East Blue, Krieg is a warning and a skill test for Luffy's readiness to enter the Grand Line, and in the Grand Line, Moria is a warning and a skill test for Luffy's readiness to enter the new world. And even though Luffy does eventually beat Moria, Moria judges that he has failed. With your strength, you'll just die anyway if you continue your voyage. You're not fit for the new world. It seems that you have a couple of good underlings, but you'll lose all of them. And in the very next arc, exactly that happens. Luffy loses his entire crew. So Luffy really should have taken these words a bit more seriously, but Luffy does not take Gecko Moria seriously at all, such as when he stated, "So anyway, I'm gonna go beat up Moria." That is the glorious call to battle our captain uses walking into the climax of Thriller Bark. And I think that's how we as readers, or at least how I felt as well, because Moria, he's a warlord of the sea. Oh, big deal. We've already beaten one of those dudes ages ago. Also, his bounty is only 320 million berries, which was barely above Luffy's then current 300 million. Although in Moria's defense as a warlord, his bounty was frozen, so that doesn't necessarily reflect his current threat level. But also, it kind of does, because you're not supposed to think about that. You're meant to see the big number and go, wow, big number. And when he's outside of Oars, a lot of Moria's fight is also turned into a joke, with Luffy kicking him up the butt, and there's one point where Moria runs away from Luffy instead of fighting with anything, even his doppelman. And it's like, what other warlord would do this? He's running away like a Scooby-Doo villain. Moria's not even taken seriously in-world, because the world government sent fellow warlord of the sea Bartholomew Kuma to be his babysitter on Thriller Bark, out of concern that Moria can't hold his own. And look, they were right to do so, because Gecko Moria is a literal one and done. After getting out of Oars, Moria powers up, then he starts and ends his 1v1 against Luffy in a single chapter, which is 482. So in terms of fight duration, he's about on par with Bellamy. But let's look at some positives here. Something I do really love about Moria is his Devil Fruit. I don't feel like we ever really got to see how amazing these powers could be, but there's a lot of conceptually strong ideas, such as Moria's revelation that the body and the shadow must always move as one. So if he manipulates the shadow, then the body has to contort to follow. I would have loved to have seen more of that, like maybe Moria manipulating the Straw Hat shadows and turning them into these crazy wacky shapes. But then again, he's a bit too passive to put himself in that kind of direct combat situation. However, Shadow's Asgard Moria has to be one of the coolest activation panels in One Piece, with Moria's red demonic eyes piercing the darkness of the Florian Triangle in order to claim all of those delicious shadows. This is the kind of Moria I wish we saw more of. There are glimpses of how amazing he can be here and there, and Shadow's Asgard arguably makes him one of the most powerful beings ever formed in One Piece. In that form, Moria was ripping through islands like biscuits before dinner. And something I definitely don't think that Moria gets enough credit for is that he's one of the only villains who has ever taken on all of the Straw Hats at once. Granted, he did it through Oars, but if not for Nightmare Luffy, he probably would have beaten the entire crew. He's a lot more of a threat than he gets credit for. But the reason why he doesn't get any of that credit is because these threats are undermined and hidden at every turn. To go back to Kuma, I definitely don't think it helps that a second warlord appears who actually does manage to defeat the entire crew, making Moria seem a little bit lame by comparison. Imagine if during Alabasta, Doflamingo appeared to have a bit of a chit-chat with Crocodile, then Crocodile was beaten, and Doflamingo soloed the entire crew. That would take a lot away from Crocodile. And this doesn't get any better in retrospect either, because after finding out Kuma's backstory, that character becomes so much more compelling and commands even more attention than he originally did. However, I will say that Kuma plays very nicely into Gecko Moria's theme of obedience. Moria even calls Kuma the most obedient warlord, and Kuma is a direct counter to Moria's powers. Because as a cyborg, sure, I guess you can try and steal his shadow, but he will never be obedient to Moria. That's just not his programming. So Kuma's even beating Gecko Moria at his own idea. But also, Moria only really starts to take an active role by piloting his meat mech Oars after Kuma arrives. So Kuma gets to the island, he delivers the message from the world government, happened, and then Moria instantly becomes obedient, as if he's been caught wanking at work by his boss, showing us once and for all that Moria is not the company owner he claims to be, but an employee, and one who is extremely obedient whenever his big bosses are mentioned. He's also a very unfortunate sandwich victim. In the grand scheme of arc antagonists, Gecko Moria slots right between Rob Lucci and Kizaru, which is not a great place to be. And in general, I think the impression of Thriller Bark suffers a lot from its direct juxtaposition with Water 7 and Sabati. But we do have some more good news because Gecko Moria does have a post-villain arc. Gecko Moria goes on to appear during Marineford, but there's really not a whole lot more to say about him here. This event really was more of a full stop on everything we knew about him, which is that he's just not good enough to compete on this level. He was a big shadowy fish in a small and polluted pond that no one ever goes near because it smells weird. And Doflamingo even states that Moria isn't strong enough to be a warlord anymore, and the world government tries to assassinate Moria for the crime of being weak. This is his lowest point. At this stage, Moria has lost everything. His crew, his warlord title, the respect from both the readers and the in-world characters, and he takes a long time to reflect on this, choosing not to reappear until over 300 chapters and 8 years later when he's invading Hachinosu and gets caught by Blackbeard. It's then assumed that he escaped off-screen during Garp's invasion of Hachinosu, where Garp also got captured. So there you go, look, Moria did exactly what Garp did, just less cool. But Gecko Moria's future is now a giant question mark. For most of the last decade, this character has been in limbo, which, to be fair, is exactly what he was doing when he was relevant as well. He was stagnating on Thriller Bark, and now he's still doing that, just in a more mobile way. I have no idea where Gecko Moria is going to land in the grand scheme of the story. I'm actually a bit surprised that he didn't join Blackbeard when it was offered. However, that does tell us one important thing about Gecko Moria, which is that he has reignited at least part of his ambition. Previously, he was willing to sell himself to the world government to be in a position of comfort, but now, potentially with his life on the line, he refuses to submit to another higher power. Whatever Gecko Moria is doing, it's now on his own terms. And while it's not the greatest and most fleshed out post-filling character arc in One Piece, it is something, and it holds a sliver of promise for the future. When all is said and done, Moria is a monument to Eiichiro Oda willing to take risks with the highest selling and what is quite possibly the most scrutinized manga of all time. He could have done something easy and generic and crowd-pleasing, but he didn't. And that's commendable, even if it didn't quite pay off as much as he may have hoped. There's a lot of great ideas going on with Gecko Moria, but to me, they don't hit as hard as what most other arc antagonists have to offer. But Gecko Moria, he put in a decent job, so we'll give him a decent C tier. And you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next. This is Spandam, one of the most despised characters in all of the One Piece, who just so happens to be a major antagonist in one of the most beloved sagas of all. Spandam's role is highly undervalued, and I will make the argument in this video that Spandam is the single most devastating villain that the Straw Hats defeated pre-time skip. And if you think that's an absurd claim, then mate, you do not remember half of what this man did. It was so much more than just pissing himself and beating up a woman. So let's dig in, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring one of the most punchable faces in One Piece, Spandam. Alright, so the first thing we need to establish is that Spandam is a dual antagonist. On rare occasions, Oda constructs arcs and even whole sagas with dual antagonists at the helm. They're given equal narrative weighting and excel in different areas. Examples of this would be Hody Jones and Vanderdecken on Fishman Island, as well as Kaido and Orochi on Wano, and in this case, Spandam's partner would of course be one Rob Lucci. And I don't know if this is a controversial thing to say, but it's true. Rob Lucci cannot carry the Water 7 saga on his own. No chance. And Spandam is every bit as important as he is, perhaps even a little bit more. But being a dual antagonist, Spandam is engineered to be a direct contrast to Rob Lucci. And this is made apparent as soon as humanly possible by Oda, because the very moment that Spandam and Rob Lucci are in the same room together is when the CP9 power levels are measured, with Rob Lucci emerging with a monstrous 4,000 Doriki, while Spandam has a pathetic 9 Doriki, which puts him below even an average fodder marine. But pick any area and you will immediately see the contrast. Rob Lucci, he's overly serious, while Spandam, he's overly goofy. And there's even an animal and tamer dynamic at play, with all of CP9 being designed around animals, and Spandam's childhood consisting of having all sorts of exotic pets, such as an elephant. When it comes down to it though, Rob Lucci, he is our punch villain. He's like the wall we need to overcome, whereas Spandam is the spiritual villain. He is the idea that we need to defeat, as well as the mastermind behind the entire saga to begin with. So here's a cool thing. Very, very unusually, our introduction to Spandam occurs in a flashback. I can't recall if that's ever happened before or since with a major arc antagonist, because even Jack the Drought was introduced before the Zoe flashback. So it's a fascinating start because everything about Spandam is a bit off in the pantheon of One Piece antagonists, because we're also introduced to him as he accidentally gets shot by a young Frankie. So we're treated to this introductory shot, and the pun, I guess, not intended, but it's there, of the primary antagonist, and it's almost as if Spandam has already been defeated before he did a single thing in the story. And this was done by Oda to catch us off guard, to subvert our expectations of Spandam. You see this stupid introduction, and there's no way anyone can take him seriously. But then Spandam goes on to show you that it's a mistake to underestimate him. Spandam's character is about as literal of a representation as we can get of the old comedy and tragedy theater masks. Whenever Spandam is on page or on screen, he will either be acting as a hilarious court jester or committing an act so horrific that it makes us question humanity as a whole. Nothing Rob Lucci has ever done or will ever do can compete with both the horrors and the hilarity that Spandam brings to the One Piece world. And Oda was originally going to make Spandam even more of an aesthetic joke, as his earlier design intended Spandam to have a much more blatant panda theme. But instead, he actually has a design that you can take, semi-seriously. And I actually think that if Spandam could battle fight on the level of Rob Lucci or even, a Kaku, then he would be incredibly popular with the fan base. But one of the major aspects of Spandam is that he was shockingly capable as a major antagonist. Spandam, on his own, researched the history of Water 7 and came to the conclusion that Tom had the blueprints for the ancient weapon Pluton. Spandam did that, and the 5 Elder Stars then put Spandam in charge of acquiring these blueprints. He spoke to the 5 Elders directly, which then became part of an operation that spans the better part of a decade and was directly responsible for the events of the entire Water 7 saga. And for that matter, Spandam then goes on to be promoted to the director of CP9, as well as the effective leader of all of Enies Lobby, which put Spandam in a very exclusive trio of facility heads, rubbing shoulders with the chief warden of Impel Down and the fleet admiral stationed at Marineford. Furthermore, Spandam was also trusted with the power of a buster call, something that only admirals and above have access to. So this might be a bit of a stunning statement, but Spandam may very well be the single most powerful and or influential individual that the Straw Hats face pre-time skip. Remember, when we talk about power, we're not just talking about, physical punch fighting power. We're talking about the power to press a golden snail and destroy an island. Because it's absolutely mind-boggling to think of the position that Spandam held. He's weak, he's petty, he's straight up a joke most of the time, and that is the strength of this character. Because you never expect anything of substance to come from him. So in those moments where all of a sudden substance emerges, it hits real hard. So much harder than characters that you expect it to come from. And a phenomenal example of this is Frankie's flashback, where Spandam commandeered and used the Battle Frankies to frame Tom and his workers, which resulted in Tom's execution. And just look how smug our Spanda is about it. And fair, why shouldn't he be? It was a perfectly thought out and well executed plan. Spandam is legitimately dangerous, and he's feeble proof that you don't need physical power to be a force in this world. Although Spandam himself is well aware of what he lacks in terms of said power, which is why he always makes sure to keep a well-stocked battle entourage, which is very much key to Spandam's motivations. What Spandam wants is to become a hero of the world. He wants to become the next Garp, but in his own twisted way. But lacking that raw power, he needed to adopt a smaller scale Kaido method. So what Spandam wanted was a small scale army of elite agents. Spandam tirelessly worked towards building the strongest team of fighters he possibly could in order to further his goals, recruiting from the best of the Cypherpol program, and even giving his agents devil fruits, which I need to emphasize is not an easy thing to do. Jabra even sees this and he is shocked. Director, how did you get 2 devil fruits? Where did you find them? To which Spandam eerily replied that he has connections and to consume the devil fruits for future battles. Finding devil fruits, it is not easy, which is why Kaido had to resort to making them artificially. And Spandam isn't stupid either. He looks stupid, he sounds stupid, he acts stupid, but he is not that. And there is a point where he orders CP9 to kill the Straw Hats, but only once they enter the Tower of Justice to ensure that he remains protected at all times. Spandam is an abhorrent coward, but he's not a dumb coward. And I think it's particularly impressive when you realize that Spandam is the chief antagonist of not only Frankie's story, but also Robin's. This dude is the lead architect of 2 Straw Hat tragedies. And there is this fantastically ominous line that I love that Spandam says during the sea train section. The world may be wide, but the only 2 humans who have the key to reviving that ancient weapon are on the sea train as we speak and on their way to me, which is an absolutely bone-chilling line. If that had been said by someone who could, punch, like your Kaidos or your Doflamingos, then this would be one of the most scarily quotable lines in One Piece. But because it came from Spandam, it gets easily forgotten, and it shouldn't be, and neither should he. Another aspect of Spandam that goes heavily underrated is his belief in justice. Spandam is a practitioner of absolute justice, which immediately separates him from a villain like Orochi, who is almost entirely driven by selfishness. And I'm not saying that Spandam is selfless, because to quote him, the most important thing is my life and increasing my status. He's definitely got his own interests, but those interests intersect with his justice beliefs. Spandam, in pursuing his own goals, genuinely believes that he is building a better world. It is right and good that we kill fools who interfere with us. They are sacrifices made for world peace. Of course, we must eliminate fishmen and any other traitors who will not readily comply. A bit weird to single out the fisherman race there, but yeah, sure, right, Spandam? I believe you. Or more accurately, I believe that you believe you. I guess Spandam is just a bit of a lucky guy, because other believers of absolute justice like Sakazuki don't enjoy what they do, but they know it must be done. It's a means to an end. However, Spandam is a very lucky boy because he happens to enjoy both the means and the end, so he's giddy for justice at all times. I think my favorite justice-related line is when Spandam says to Robin, "Your obsession with living is disgusting," because that is straight out of the Sakazuki Justice Seminar. A criminal wanting to live? Disgusting. But Spandam is a devout follower, and I think his modern reintroduction during the Water 7 arc really emphasizes that, as Oda then elected to draw Spandam as a genuinely menacing presence, with the true artistic gravitas of what we've come to expect of One Piece antagonists. Although that impression fades pretty quickly as well, because let's talk about comedy. As I said previously, half the time Spandam is a court jester, and one of my favorite Spandam scenes in the series is him eating lunch after Robin has been captured, and he says, "This is the best break ever." And then he starts monologuing about his evil plan whilst being sucked off by an elephant. Then there's also a part during Frankie's flashback where Spandam knocks a can of paint onto his head. And the fact that his subordinates have no respect for him and also deliberately mess with him for fun. Like the series of gags where Califer is constantly accusing Spandam of sexual harassment for saying her name responding to her statement, and my personal favorite, just the very fact that Spandam exists, which even led to an iconic piece of fan art depicting a fictional 4th accusation. And Spandam's subordinates also enhance his comedy by being complete whack jobs themselves. Specifically the trio of Kumadori, Jabra, and Fukuro, whose collective incompetence actually makes Spandam look like an incredibly decent leader by comparison. Which he is. Spandam, honestly, he's not a bad leader. But considering all of the horrible things he's done, and yeah, we're gonna get into those, he really shouldn't be as funny as he is. But he is. Spandam is this bizarre source of comedy gold in One Piece. And sometimes the official English translation even unintentionally makes him sound funnier. Like that time when he ordered CP9 to, quote, rub out 3 people. And who knows, maybe Spandam meant what I read, but I think it would be a gross misuse of world government resources if so. But all allusions to jerking off aside, Spandam is one of the more notoriously sadistic antagonists who borders on world noble qualifications and sadism. So he's got this particular maneuver he likes to pull, I call it the Spandam, and what he does right is he steps on people's heads when they're down, usually when they're tied up as well. He did it to Tom, he did it to Frankie, and of course he did it to Robin. Spandam is one of the types of people that I dislike most in this world, which is a sore winner. Every time he's in an advantageous position, which is most of his run as a villain, he just has to keep rubbing it in. He needs you to know that he, Spandam, has won and you, loser, have lost. To the point where I'm sure he's written it on his boot and he is forcing your face to read it as he kicks you into the floor. However, it is undeniably Robin who primarily suffers, and her time with Spandam is what the fanbase remembers him for most, which, to remind everyone who already remembers, began with Spandam saying, "From now on, you will know suffering that will make you wish you had died many times over. I'm going to torment you and use you and throw you into the sea. That's how grave your crimes are." And I should point out that when he says he'll use her, Spandam is referring to her knowledge, not, her body. Because just like making the comedy line unintentionally funnier, the official English translation also sometimes unintentionally makes his tragedy sound so much worse. Because that line can be read as Spandam saying that he intends to full-on R-word Robin. But Spandam has generational ties with Robin as well, because it was his father Spandine, who commanded CP9 during the O'Hara incident, that initiated the Buster Call. Yes, Sakazuki, he may have led the destruction and personally committed the genocide, but it was Spandine who gave that order. So Spandam is far more than just a dude who repeatedly beats Robin up. Spandam is the terrifying specter that has haunted her for 2 decades. And really, no family has done more damage to the Straw Hats than Spandam and his father, because together they caused 2 whole flashbacks. And then there's the mask. What seems like a bit of a superfluous design is actually directly inspired by the WWE wrestler Mankind, which could not be a more appropriate choice because Spandam is meant to be the personification of Robin's enemies in the Water 7 saga. And since the whole world is against her, that would make Robin's enemy all mankind. On multiple occasions, Spandam even uses that one specific word. He says that we are working for the peace of all mankind and such. So I don't think this mask is coincidental. And as a side note, Mick Foley, the performer who portrayed Mankind, found out about Oda's tribute in 2015 and tweeted, "Gimmick infringement? ? But with how much of a sheer prick he is, it is always satisfying to see Spandam get hurt. Whether it's being punched by Tom, thwacked by Frankie, bit by Frankie, shot by Usopp, or clutched by Robin, these are cheer-worthy moments. And villains have to work so hard to earn those moments. Not every One Piece antagonist can do this, especially not so consistent. However, my main Spandam criticism is that I think Oda made Spandam very one-note in the final stages of Enies Lobby. Every time we cut to him, he's doing one of 2 things. Either he's physically beating Robin or stating a variant of, "Haha, your friends are fools who cannot do the thing you want them to do." And I get very tired of both of those things, so to me, he really starts falling a bit flat. As opposed to his arc partner Rob Lucci, who we flesh out a lot during this time, and he ends up properly making his mark on this series. Spandam, to me, he lost his edge. He always had that balance of wacky and serious, but I don't know, towards the end of Enies Lobby, the idea of taking him seriously at all kind of just slipped away, because he turned into this really over-the-top, brutal, stereotypical mustache twirling antagonist, tying Robin to the train tracks. But I also think that Oda was a few stops too brutal with Spandam in the final stages of Enies Lobby, to the point where his punishment was, in my opinion, grossly inadequate compared to the crime committed. To put his crimes into perspective, over the course of Enies Lobby, and just Enies Lobby, Spandam punches, kicks, slaps, drags, smashes into a wall with an elephant sword, and of course smashes Robin's face into the ground. He also pulls Robin's hair on 3 separate occasions, in addition to the constant bombardment of psychological abuse. And I think considering all of that, he got off incredibly lightly. The move Robin ultimately used to finish him off looked painful as crap, especially in the anime where you see his back break. But to me, it's more of a comedy ending, which doesn't match the tone of what he was doing to Robin, and makes Spandam's final defeat quite unsatisfying for me. Because he goes and does all of that, and we let him off with a bit of standard Robin slapstick clutch. I wanted a lot more. However, a couple of good things though. It was really nice seeing both Robin and Frankie team up to take Spandam down, because they were the 2 most affected by him. And I also think it's very appropriate that Spandam was defeated after Rob Lucci. He was the final member of CP9 to go down, which I think reflects quite well on his status as Saga antagonist. But I also think that Spandam is quite lacking in his post-antagonist character arc, because while CP9 get a bit of redemption in their cover story, Spandam doesn't evolve at all and continues being a general prick from his hospital bed. And he does appear post-time skip as part of CP0, where the big twist is that he is now Rob Lucci's subordinate. I do like that flip, but at the same time, I have yet to understand why they made Spandam a CP0 member. I 100% get why he'd be the director of CP9, because he's not a bad leader and he's very good with all of the plans. Spandam's very effective, and clumsiness aside, he makes a lot of the right calls. But what use is he as an agent? He has nothing going for him in that regard. My hope is that Spandam, as many other defeated villains do, goes on to learn some humility after his failure within this new position. Although in volume 777, the Film Gold companion volume, it is said that Spandam is now on a mission to find a cure for his father's disease sees, which is very nice, but it's not because he cares about him, it's because it's part of a plot to overthrow Rob Lucci. So it looks like Spandam has learned very little, if anything, and while it's always nice to see him again, he's not like the other recurring villains who I get incredibly excited to follow whenever their stories pop up. But there's a lot Spandam deserves credit for. I can't think of many characters that I despise with every fiber of my being on one page, and then on the next find absolutely hilarious. That balance is incredibly difficult to strike, and whatever story sorcery Oda invoked here needs to be praised. Because Spandam has a rather heavy legacy on fans. No one wants to see him again, but he is constantly cited as one of the most hated characters in One Piece for all of the right reasons. Most recently, I took a poll of over 7,000 viewers, and Spandam ranked as the 5th most hated character in the series, 2 whole spots above Sakazuki. That's a pretty damn impressive legacy to have. To be more hated than the man who killed Ace. And while I think he does fall flat at the last moment, Spandam does a remarkable job helming what is very consistently considered to be the best saga in One Piece. He's not the coolest, he's not the strongest, but my god, he was a vicious shot of distilled villainy that not only forged 2 whole straw hats, but also came incredibly close to ripping the entire crew apart. So with all of that in mind, Spandam was an extraordinary villain, and I think deserves a B tier for accomplishing so much whilst being objectively and measurably the weakest antagonist in the entire series. But you let me know in the comments who you'd like to see ranked next. This is Wapol. He sustains himself on a surprisingly healthy diet of ships, garbage, and even people for that sweet hit of protein. And in a manner best described as somehow, Wapol found his way into becoming the main antagonist of the Drum Island arc, much to controversial reception. So Wapol is a difficult character because I both love and hate him. And today you, the audience, are going to act as my fictional pirate psychologist to explore my Wapol-based issues, because we are on a mission to rank every major antagonist in the most comprehensive and exhaustive way possible, video by video, this time featuring the hungry hippo himself, Tin Plate Wapol. So something I love to do in this series is analyze the very first panel that a villain appears in, because they're often very carefully crafted to give us a striking and unique first impression. But Wapol's first panel is incredibly unremarkable compared to almost every other villain, and I actually think that's a great way to sum Wapol up. You just see a dude gorging himself with an ornate knife, and you only realize how ornate the knife is in the panel where he finishes eating it, which establishes Wapol as a villain of great consumption. He has a devil fruit that will allow him to eat anything, and in fact it requires him to consistently keep eating. He cannot stop. And it's a not so subtle metaphor of wealthy kings consuming their nations for their own personal benefit, just in this case that consumption is very literal. For example, when Wapol returns to Drum Island, we have this gem of a speech. "Hear me, my people. Everything in this country is my candy, and I prefer my houses cooked well done." So it seems like a bit of a tired concept now, but Drum Island is the first arc that takes place within an actual kingdom, and Wapol is the very first king we meet. And I know these days everything's in a kingdom with a king, but this was our initial venture into the topic, and Oda had a lot to say. She's not heavily featured in the Drum arc, but a lot of Wapol is designed to contrast Princess Vivi as well as eventually King Cobra of Alabasta. Because this is our introduction to kings, Wapol is supposed to show us the exact opposite of what royalty should be, so that during Alabasta, Nefertari Vivi can step up to show us how a true leader acts, which we do get a couple of tastes of during Drum, notably when Vivi calls Luffy a failure as a captain and begs Dalton for help. What we see here is a princess on her hands and knees, ready and willing to part with all dignity to some common man guy, all for the sake of her people. Whereas Wapol, even at the last second when it was clear that he was going to be beaten by Luffy, couldn't even humble himself to offer Luffy a position higher than, quote, vice king. And then another taste comes with the Reverie flashback, where Wapol slaps child Vivi, and she very maturely and diplomatically apologizes to Wapol for something that she didn't do. And something I've always found interesting is that Vivi and Wapol essentially did the same thing. Their nation suffered a crisis, and so they left, with the key contrast between them being why they left. Vivi fled in order to hunt down the identity of the person causing Alabasta's problems and to seek help for the sake of her people, whereas Wapol immediately fled and left his people as sacrifices to ensure his own personal safety. And after hearing about this, Vivi She is enraged on a scale that even Crocodile struggled to get her to. Because Crocodile, he's an evil bad villain dude. Of course he's going to do evil bad villain things, but Walpole, mate, he is a king. And on Alabaster at least, being a king means protecting your people above all else. But Walpole isn't just a false king in spirit, it's also quite literal. Because when he fled the island, he immediately rejected the title of king and took on the title of pirate captain. And then when he returned to Drum, there is this sickening scene where Walpole declares that he is no longer a pirate and he is a king once again. He has an inability to take accountability for anything, such as when Dalton recounted Walpole expelling the nation's doctors and he just replies, "Couldn't be helped, that's politics," as if he, the king who makes all of the decisions, had no choice in the matter. And so Walpole is only a king when it suits him. And then as soon as it actually comes to performing kingly duties, well, all of a sudden he's a pirate. King Cobra of Alabaster once said some very poignant words, which were, "Never forget, a country is its people," which hits as hard as it does, partially because Walpole demonstrates the exact opposite philosophy, where a country is its king. And that doesn't work because Drum is falling apart. But that's the thing with Walpole though. A lot of his character is meant to be the foundation of the Alabaster arc, which I think is a great credit to Oda's planning, but Alabaster is not this arc. And I think this may contribute to why Walpole feels a bit underwhelming during his own tenure as an antagonist. This is pretty common with early One Piece villains, but we also don't have a lot to work with in terms of motivation and backstory. By all accounts, Walpole's father was an absolute boss of a king who oversaw the great medical society of Drum and was even able to command Dalton's loyalty. But we never get to see what happened to turn Walpole into the exact opposite. We're told it's because he was spoiled as a child, but I don't know, to me that doesn't really cut it. At least not compared to the depth that we'd go into with future villains and even some of the past ones. What I would have loved is even a one-page flashback to show the difference in parts between Vivi and Walpole, because they were both raised by ideal kings, and yet they could not have turned out as more opposite rulers themselves. And another key role that Walpole exists for is to facilitate Chopper's story. Drum Island used to be known as the Great Medical Land, with the most advanced and skilled of doctors in all of the Grand Line. And we do see an example of this because the Ishi 20 are able to heal Walpole even after Dalton decapitates him. So these doctors are genuine miracle workers, and Walpole robbed this country of those miracles. And so enter Dr. Hiraluk, one of the only two physicians remaining on Drum not under Walpole's control, and someone who, medically, is completely powerless to do anything of substance. In fact, he often makes things worse, but he is determined to return miracles to Drum Island. Again, medically, he's worse than useless, but Hiraluk was trying to find a cure for people's hearts, a sickness directly inflicted by Walpole's rule. And really, Walpole's plan for Drum Island is horrifying. The idea of restricting the supply of doctors available in order to push up the prices of consultations, procedures, and medicines. So squeezing people in order to enhance his own personal wealth. And there is admittedly a sickening logic to the numbers, and Walpole definitely treated his country more like a business designed to extract maximum profit, which is a skill that would actually be expanded on in Walpole's later One Piece appearances. Here's one of my Walpole problems though. During Drum Island, he's very much meant to be the Spandam to Chopper's Robin, a nexus of tragedy. But while I perfectly understand Spandam, I do question Walpole. Because for one, I don't think the Walpole going after Hiraluk makes a lot of sense from any perspective, because Walpole's most defining characteristics are this bizarre sadism and insatiable greed, and or gluttony. So look, option one, you want to be as much of a sadistic prick as you can. Great, all for it. But in that case, you would leave Hiraluk alone because he's actually doing more damage to the people of Drum than he is good. So Walpole should consider him like an entertaining jester. Or option number two, you are super greedy, cool, also on board with it. And now what you do, right, is you leave Hiraluk alone to emphasize how much you need to pay for Walpole care. Because if you don't, then you are going to be treated non-consensually by a quack doctor who is very likely to end up killing you. I mean, I get the quote logic. Walpole wants Hiraluk executed because he's a criminal with all of his doctoring and such. But like so many things about Walpole, it is such weak reasoning. And you could say that, yeah, Walpole's just dumb, but he's not really. He comes up with brilliantly evil ideas whenever money is involved. And even if he was just dumb, that's very rarely a satisfying excuse in storytelling. It feels like a poorly built bridge. Where we come from and where we get to, very important, with Hiraluk inspiring Dalton in the issue 20, but it was a very flimsy bridge that we had to cross to get there. And I personally feel like Walpole targets Hiraluk simply because of story, the fact that we need to connect him emotionally to Chopper and thus to Luffy. And I really don't think it's Oda's finest work in that regard. And in the end, Walpole's not even responsible for Hiraluk's death. He was already going to die twice over by disease and mushroom. So it's hard to even claim that Walpole had a huge effect on Chopper's backstory because the tragedy was going to happen either way. And personally, I feel like Walpole very much lacks the agency of a main main antagonist and is very much banking on incidental tragedy happening around him. And I guess one argument you could make is that Walpole exists to explore the idea of monsters, because the two major drum figures are Chopper and Dalton, both of which are literal animals and monster people due to their devil fruits, but in the end, they're both far more human than Walpole, who is the real monster. I feel like that's kind of weak as well though, and I don't really know how much I buy that. But even so, let's accept it. There's still a problem in that while Chopper is such a huge part of this arc, he and Walpole spend almost no time on screen together. Our major protagonist and our major antagonist are almost like completely separate entities, so it's really hard to solidify that emotional oomph between them. And really, the person who Walpole spends the most time on screen with is actually Luffy, because Luffy fights Walpole 3 times. That is as many rounds as Crocodile got. To be fair, Walpole does provide a similar contrast with Luffy that he does to Vivi. Walpole is a man who goes out of his way to harm those around him, even and especially if it's not in his best interests. Like when the avalanche was approaching and he refused to allow any of the doctors who just saved his life to get on Robson and then potentially left them all to die buried in the snow. And then against that, we have Luffy, who was prepared to die to save Nami and Sanji, going through one of the most painful experiences in the series of climbing the Drum Rockies barehand and barefoot, all to save his quote, "frems." But really the greatest challenge that Walpole gives Luffy is on the philosophy of flags, which led to the most iconic panel of Drum Island and one of the most iconic in all of One Piece, where Luffy states that Hiruluk's Jolly Roger is unbreakable. And while a phenomenal moment for Luffy, I will say that it doesn't really do anything for Walpole, except make him look even more underwhelming because he doesn't even have the villainous power to destroy a single flag. To me, this is the moment that the fight was over and everything that comes after it is kind of shown in formality. Because Walpole isn't a villain capable of challenging Luffy either ideologically or philosophically. And I think to be a truly successful One Piece villain, you need to do at least one of those, well, ideally both. But Walpole can't challenge Luffy's ideology because he doesn't have an ideology, which isn't something that you can accuse many, if any other One Piece villains of. Even the ones I criticize most do have internal ideological consistency. For example, in Orange Town, Buggy, he was a very flat villain, but he was there to embody the idea of treasure, and he was incredibly consistent with that. If we move to Baratier, we have Don Krieg, who is also less than a fan favorite, but he was very consistent with the idea of firepower versus willpower. And then you've got Hody Jones, who may be the most disliked villain in all of One Piece, and yet he was still so consistent with being a specter of hatred. And that consistency is what I feel like Walpole's missing. He doesn't have a solid purpose like almost every other One Piece villain does. He's designed to counter the ideology of a series of characters, but it doesn't fall under the umbrella of his own. And so what Oda does is stretch Walpole across 3 different ideas that don't really blend well together. Challenging Vivi about what it means to be a leader, then maybe he's challenging Chopper on what it is to be a monster, and kind of, but not really challenging Luffy on what it is to be a pirate. Walpole dips his fingers into all of these pies, and so you get a little taste of each pie, but not a satisfying meal, which I guess is actually kind of fitting for a character who can never be satisfied by eating, but it also doesn't satisfy me reading his run as a villain. With Walpole, I genuinely don't understand why he does 50% of the things he does, because half the time he's not just screwing other people over, he is directly harming himself with his decision making. And again, he's not dumb. I mean, he is sometimes he's real dumb, but sometimes he's real not dumb. It's inconsistent. And the conclusion I come to for why this is simply because Walpole wasn't a fully baked antagonist. The strongest thing he does is the idea of royalty by contrasting Vivi, but she's barely in the drum arc. So this leaves Walpole floundering and very much just being bad for the sake of being bad. So every time I reread or rewatch the Drum Island arc, I'm very aware that what I'm watching is an over-the-top caricature. Walpole is evil because we need someone to beat up. And I should note that this isn't just my impression as a man on the internet. Probably the biggest black mark against Walpole's competence as an antagonist is when the One Piece franchise itself admitted that he simply was not good enough. And it did this with One Piece Movie 9, episode of Chopper Plus, which if you're unfamiliar, that was an era of One Piece where original movies were getting a bit stale, so they started remaking old arcs and packaging them as films that you actually had to go and pay to see in a cinema. And so for one of them, they chose to remake the Drum Island arc, which is set in an alternate universe where the crew lands there after Water 7. So Frankie and Robin are sort of in the movie. They don't do a lot, but they are there. But the production staff had a big problem to solve, which is that Walpole is not the kind of antagonist who can helm a movie. And their response to this was to more or less replace Walpole with his non-canon older brother Mashudu. And what Mashudu represents is the potential that Walpole never quite reached. Mashudu is every bit as cruel and as entitled as Walpole, but his actions actually make sense with his motivation. Meanwhile, Walpole spends most of the movie completely empty-headed and doing whatever Mashudu tells him to do, although the film does try to explain this, because at the climax, Walpole does eat Mashudu and take the mantle of antagonist just in time for Luffy to finish him off. And it's explained in a sort of, this was my Wapol plan all along. But by that point, it's too late because he is seconds away from being dismissed. And here's the craziest part about this movie. In the end, it's explained that this was all Chopper's dream. He wakes up on the Thousand Sunny and returns to fictional reality. But just let that idea sink in. Even in world, Chopper sees Wapol as such a limited threat that his imagination had to conjure a scarier and more competent older brother to take his place. And I just don't think that you would dare do this with any other series antagonist. I should say any other series primary antagonist. Even the ones I'm most critical towards, like Captain Kuro. If for whatever reason they ever made a Syrup Village movie, there is a 0% chance that they would replace Kuro with his scarier older brother. So Wapol is a failure of villainy that I'm not sure has ever happened before or since in One Piece. However, thankfully, Wapol does have one saving grace, and it's the big one, being his post-antagonist character arc, where he goes on a riches to rags to riches again journey of starting his own toy business after eating garbage and accidentally revolutionizing the world by creating a new metal alloy to the point where he becomes extraordinarily wealthy, and even Frankie Shogun is built out of this Wapo metal, which I love, because Wapol's character undergoes his own personal industrial revolution. And so he goes from a depiction of consumerism under a monarchy to a depiction of consumerism under a capitalist society. Because Wapol is now, without question, the most successful businessman in One Piece, having made enough money to just flat out buy his own kingdom. And even though he's changed a lot less than some may like, I do at least have a level of respect for him now. On Drum Island, he inherited a kingdom from his father and ran it into the ground with his horrible decision making. However, Wapol has now managed to build a new kingdom from the ground up, and yeah, it took a little bit of luck, but Wapol put in the work and made himself worthy of the title of king for the very first time. He also went on to marry Miss Universe and almost lived happily ever after, before he, of all people, saw Emu and the Five Elders' true forms, and is now one of the most wanted men on the planet. After Drum Island is where I think Oda really figured out who this character is and how he works best, which is not as a serious antagonist who does genuinely horrible things, but instead as a side character with questionable motives but very high comic value that you do actually start to root for and get excited to see again. In any other shonen, Wapol, he would be a throwaway villain who we'd never see again. And it's a huge credit to Oda that he managed to spin Wapol into this strangely lovable side character. But unfortunately, side characters are not really what this video series is all about. Looking back on it, I feel like I've spent a lot of this video speaking about characters who aren't Wapol, examining Vivi, Chopper, Hirolook, Luffy, and even Dalton, when I really should be talking about Wapol. But there's really not a lot to say because there's just not a lot there. Wapol is one of the premier examples of a podium villain in One Piece. During Drum Island, he exists purely to elevate other characters, and when Olympians receive their gold medals, no one really wants to know the story of the podium or even consciously remembers that a podium ever existed. That's Wapol. As a villain, he accomplishes some things, but he scores low marks in almost every area imaginable, except for his post-character arc. And he doesn't even have the foxy excuse of claiming that this is just a pure comic relief villain, because even though Wapol is a joke a lot of the time, he does cause serious harm, and we are supposed to take him seriously because he is the main antagonist of not just any story arc, but a Straw Hat-centric story arc. And I really do feel like Wapol is our first and perhaps only example of an E-tier villain, because as much as I love Wapol dearly, it's for everything he did after Drum, because what he did on Drum Island amounted to so little that they had to practically replace him with an entirely new villain in the movie remake. But you let me know in the comments which villain you'd like to see ranked next.